Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been holding this story inside for almost 2 years now, and I think I'm finally ready to share what happened to me and my husband Terry at Lake Forlorn. I've always been a rational person. I work in accounting, for crying out loud. But what we experienced that night in September 2022 completely changed how I see the world. I haven't been able to look at lakes or forests the same way since. Terry and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We both needed a break from our hectic lives in Seattle, and Lake Forlorn seemed perfect, secluded, peaceful, and far enough from the city to really disconnect. We'd never been there before, but a colleague of mine had mentioned it was a hidden gem in Washington state. Looking back, maybe there was a reason it wasn't more popular. We brought our German Shepherd, Barry, with us. He's usually the most laid-back dog you'll ever meet. Nothing fazes him. That's why his behavior that night still haunts me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We arrived at the lake around 2 p.m. on a Friday. The drive there was longer than expected, mostly because the last 5 miles were on this narrow, unpaved road that seemed to go on forever. When we finally reached the lake, we were the only ones there. At first we thought that was great. Having the whole place to ourselves felt like such a luxury. The lake itself was beautiful in a somewhat unsettling way. It was surrounded by tall pines that seemed to lean over the water, and there was this constant mist hanging just above the surface, even though it was a warm day. We found a decent spot to set up camp about 50 feet from the shoreline, on a small clearing that gave us a good view of the water. Everything was fine for the first few hours. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and Terry even managed to catch a couple of small fish for dinner. Barry was having a blast, running around and exploring the area. But as the sun started to set, things began to feel different. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. And I don't mean regular forest quiet, I mean absolutely dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Barry noticed it too. He stopped playing and just sat next to our camp chairs, ears perked up, staring at the lake. Around 7:30 p.m., when the sun was just starting to set, I saw something that made my skin crawl. I was sitting by our small campfire, and I happened to glance at the lake. The mist had gotten thicker, but through it I swear I saw something move across the surface. Not like a fish jumping or a duck swimming. This was different. It looked like a dark shape, just gliding through the water, barely making a ripple. I pointed it out to Terry, but by the time he looked, it was gone. I tried to brush it off, but then Barry started acting strange. He's a brave dog. He once chased off a bear that got too close to our backyard. But that evening, he was different. He kept making this low, whining sound and pressing himself against our legs. When we tried to take him for his evening walk, he flat out refused to go anywhere near the lake. As night fell completely, things got worse. We started hearing these sounds, not animal sounds, at least not any animals I've ever heard. They were like deep, resonant whoops coming from across the lake. They'd start low and then rise in pitch, almost like whale songs, but somehow wrong. Terry tried to record them on his phone, but the recording just came out as static. Around 9 p.m., we saw them. I'll never forget this as long as I live. The mist on the lake had gotten so thick it looked like a blanket. But then we noticed these huge, dark shapes moving through it. They were massive, way bigger than any person. The way they moved was all wrong too. It was fluid, almost graceful, but definitely not human. We counted at least 3 of them, crossing the lake in our direction. That's when Barry lost it. He started barking like I've never heard him bark before. This terrified, desperate sound that made my blood run cold, and then, from somewhere in the darkness, something answered him. It wasn't a bark or a howl, it was this deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from something massive, something that shouldn't exist. Terry grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the lake. I wish he hadn't. For just a split second we saw it, a huge dark figure standing at the edge of the water, maybe 100 feet from us. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. But what still gives me nightmares was its face, or rather, where its face should have been. The flashlight beam just seemed to get absorbed there, like looking into a void. We didn't even discuss it. We just grabbed what we could, threw it in the car, and got out of there. I've never packed up camp so fast in my life. Terry's hands were shaking so bad he could barely get the key in the ignition. Barry was in the back seat, trembling and whining. As we drove away, I looked in the side mirror and saw multiple dark shapes emerging from the lake onto our campsite. The whole drive home, we kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced something was following us. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway, and we didn't really speak until we were back in Seattle. We left most of our camping gear behind, about $500 worth of equipment. People have asked why we didn't go back for it the next day. All I can say is that no amount of money could get me to return to Lake Forlorn. We've talked about what we saw that night many times since then, trying to make sense of it. Terry thinks they were Bigfoot, but I'm not so sure. Whatever they were, they moved through water like it was their home, and everything I've read about Bigfoot suggests they stick to land. The weirdest part? When I tried to look up Lake Forlorn later, I could barely find any information about it. The few references I did find were in old forestry reports from the 1950s, and they all mentioned unusual activity in the area that made survey work difficult. My colleague, who told me about the lake, she swears she's never heard of it, even though I clearly remember our conversation about it. We haven't been camping since that night. We sold our remaining gear, and Barry still gets anxious whenever we drive past dense forests. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to him staring out our bedroom window, making that same low whine we heard at the lake. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me this story 2 years ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had too much to drink around the campfire. But I know what we saw. More importantly, I know what we felt. That bone-deep certainty that we were in the presence of something ancient and wrong, something that didn't want us there. I'm not trying to convince anyone or prove anything. I just needed to finally get this story out. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there who've seen similar things at Lake Forlorn, or if anyone else has encountered these creatures. Part of me hopes I never find out. Some questions are better left unanswered. One last thing. If you're ever driving through Washington State and someone recommends a peaceful, secluded lake you've never heard of before, maybe do some research first. Or better yet, stick to the popular campgrounds. At least there, the only things you have to worry about are noisy neighbors and bears. My best friend Mike and I were watching my uncle's farm while he and my aunt were visiting their daughter in Colorado for 2 weeks. It was supposed to be an easy gig, just feeding the animals and making sure everything ran smoothly. The farm isn't huge, maybe 40 acres, with a small herd of goats, 12 of them, 3 guard dogs, and some chickens. Uncle Dave usually uses the goats for clearing brush and selling the offspring, so it's a pretty laid-back operation. The first 3 days were completely normal. We'd wake up, feed the animals, let the goats out to graze, check the fences, and spend the rest of the day either gaming or watching movies in the farmhouse. The dogs, 2 Great Pyrenees named Thor and Odin, and a German Shepherd named Rex, were well trained and stayed with the goats during the day. At night, we'd herd the goats back into their barn, make sure they were secure, and the dogs would patrol the property. Simple routine. But on the 4th night, something felt off. I noticed the goats were acting weird during the afternoon. They kept clustering together and bleating more than usual, and they were resistant to grazing in the far pasture where they normally loved to go. The dogs were on edge too, especially Thor, who kept staring at the tree line and growling. Mike thought maybe there were coyotes around, which made sense, but something about the animal's behavior seemed different from the usual predator response I'd seen before. That night, we got the goats in the barn earlier than usual because they were practically herding themselves in, which was strange. The dogs were seriously agitated, pacing around the barn instead of doing their usual property rounds. Around 10 p.m., while Mike and I were playing Xbox in the house, we heard the dogs start barking, not their usual alert barks, but these deep, terrified sounds I'd never heard them make before. I grabbed my uncle's rifle, he'd left it for emergencies, and Mike took a flashlight. The farmhouse is about 150 yards from the barn, and I'll never forget that walk. It was a clear night with a 3/4 moon, so we could see pretty well, but something felt deeply wrong. The air felt heavy, and there was this smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. As we got closer to the barn, the goats started making these panicked bleating sounds, and the dog's barking became more frantic. Then we heard it, this deep, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite human. Mike's flashlight beam caught movement by the barn's side door, and I swear my heart stopped. Whatever it was huge. I'm talking at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and dark fur. It was standing upright, and when the light hit it, it turned toward us. The eyes reflected the light like a deer's, but they were set in a face that was both ape-like and disturbingly human. I know how this sounds, but I know what I saw. The thing moved with shocking speed for its size. In 2 strides it reached the barn door, and, I still have trouble believing this part, it literally tore the wooden door off its hinges. The sound of splintering wood and screaming goats was deafening. The dogs, which are usually fearless, were cowering and whimpering. Mike and I were frozen. I had the rifle, but I couldn't even think about using it. The creature reached into the barn and grabbed one of the smaller goats like it was picking up a house cat. The goat's bleating cut off in a horrible choking sound, and then the thing just ran. Not like a person runs, but in these massive bounds that ate up ground impossibly fast. It disappeared into the tree line before either of us could react. We spent the rest of the night in the barn with the remaining goats and the dogs, using some scrap wood to block the entrance. The dogs wouldn't leave the barn, which told me everything I needed to know about how serious the situation was. We could hear heavy movement in the woods, and occasional deep grunts that made the hair on my neck stand up. The next morning we found massive footprints around the barn, 17 inches long at least. We moved the goats into the steel equipment shed closer to the house, which had a proper lock. We spent the rest of the week on edge, but whatever it was never came back. The goats remained skittish, and the dogs refused to patrol the far end of the property. When my uncle returned, we told him everything. He was quiet for a long time before telling us that his father, my grandfather, had seen something similar in the 60s on the same property. They'd lost livestock back then too, but no one ever believed him. I know most people will probably think this is just another made-up story, but I know what I saw. I've been around bears and mountain lions. This was something else entirely. These days, I don't go camping anymore, and I get nervous around heavily wooded areas at night. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I can still hear that deep inhuman sound it made, and I lie awake wondering if it's still out there, watching and waiting. The weirdest part? About a month after it happened, I tried researching similar incidents in the area. I found 3 reports from neighboring counties describing almost identical events: livestock taken, barn doors destroyed, and the same horrible smell, all within the past 2 years. I don't know what's out there, but I know what I saw that night wasn't human, and I hope I never see it again. Bye. I work in tech in Seattle, and like many others in my field, I was burning out from the constant deadlines and pressure. My therapist had suggested finding ways to disconnect, and I'd always loved hiking, so I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd done plenty of day hikes before, but this would be my first time camping alone. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to that tiny voice in my head telling me to bring someone along. I chose Potholes Coulee because it's less crowded than the more popular spots, and I really wanted solitude. The area is beautiful in a rugged way, all rocky cliffs and hidden lakes, with these incredible geological formations from the Ice Age floods. I'd researched the area thoroughly, packed all the essentials, and left my trip details with my sister. I thought I'd done everything right. I arrived at the trailhead around 2 p.m. on a Thursday in late June. The weather was perfect, mid-70s, slight breeze, and those big Washington state clouds that make everything look more dramatic. The parking area was empty except for my car, which should have been my first warning sign, but I was actually relieved. I wanted to be alone, right? The first few hours were exactly what I needed. I set up my campsite about 2 miles in, near one of the smaller lakes. It was so peaceful. Just the sound of water lapping at the shore and birds calling overhead. I spent some time reading, took photos of wildflowers, and even did some meditation. Around 6 p.m., I decided to take a walk around the lake before starting dinner. That's when everything changed. I was about halfway around the lake when I first saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow on the opposite shore, maybe 200 yards away, but then it moved. I stopped walking and grabbed my binoculars. Through them, I could see what looked like a large, dark figure moving between the rocks. It was hard to judge the size at that distance, but something about its proportions was wrong. Too big to be a person, wrong shape for a bear. I convinced myself it was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe a bear standing oddly. Washington has plenty of black bears, and while they're usually not aggressive, I decided to head back to camp anyway since it was getting late. That's when I heard the first splash. At first I thought it was a fish jumping. Then I heard it again, closer, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy hitting water. I turned around and saw ripples in the lake about 50 yards out. As I watched, a large rock, easily the size of a basketball, arced through the air and landed in the water maybe 30 yards from shore. My blood ran cold. Whatever was throwing those rocks had to be incredibly strong, and it was clearly aiming in my direction. I started walking faster, trying to keep my eyes on both the trail and the opposite shore. The figure I'd seen earlier was gone, but I could hear movement, heavy footsteps, and the occasional crack of branches. Then I saw it again, much closer this time, moving parallel to me through the trees about 100 yards away. Even in the early evening light, I could make out its features. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with long arms that hung below its knees. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful despite its size, as it navigated between the trees. I broke into a run. That's when the rocks started coming faster. I could hear them whistling through the air before they hit the ground or water. One crashed into a tree just ahead of me, sending bark flying. I was crying now, fumbling with my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I remember thinking I was almost back to my campsite when something hit me from behind. The impact was like being hit with a sledgehammer. I felt a sharp pain in my head, and everything started going dark around the edges. The last thing I remember was the smell, this overwhelming, musky animal odor, and the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. I woke up in Quincy Valley Medical Center. According to the nurses, a group of college students who'd come to the area for rock climbing found me unconscious on the trail around 8 p.m. I had a severe concussion, a gash on the back of my head that needed 12 stitches, and various cuts and bruises from falling. When the police came to take my statement, I told them everything. They were skeptical, of course. They suggested it might have been some kids throwing rocks, or that I'd fallen and hit my head, and my mind had filled in the gaps with an imagined attacker. But they did file a report, and one of the officers quietly told me there had been other strange reports from that area over the years. The doctors kept me overnight for observation. While I was there, one of the nurses shared that her grandfather, a member of the Yakima Nation, had stories about large beings that lived in the more remote areas of Washington. She didn't use the word Bigfoot, but she didn't have to. I returned to the site a few days later with 2 friends to collect my camping gear. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, but something felt different about the place. It felt watched. We got my things and left quickly. The park rangers investigated but found nothing conclusive. They did find some unusual tracks near where I was found, but heavy rain the night after my attack had washed away most potential evidence. They also discovered several large rocks scattered along the trail that seemed out of place, as if they'd been moved or thrown there. It's been over a year now, and I still haven't gone hiking alone. I probably never will again. My friends think I'm crazy, and maybe I am. Maybe I did just fall and hit my head. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, and what I felt. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear the whistle of those rocks flying through the air, still feel the impact that knocked me out. I'm not writing this to convince anyone of anything. I'm writing it because I need people to understand why I get nervous when they tell me they're going camping alone in remote areas, why I insist they take someone with them, or at least tell someone exactly where they'll be. Some places in this world are still wild, still unknown, and sometimes, when your instincts tell you something isn't right, the best thing you can do is listen. The rational part of my brain has spent months trying to explain what happened that day. Maybe it was a bear walking upright. Maybe it was some sick person playing a twisted prank. Maybe I really did just fall and hallucinate the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw. And I know that whatever it was intelligent enough to use tools, strong enough to throw rocks that size with incredible accuracy, and for whatever reason, it wanted me gone. I still work in tech, still live in Seattle, but I've changed. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. I've started taking self-defense classes, not that they'd help much against something that size. I've also been researching, connecting with others who've had similar experiences in the Pacific Northwest. There are more of us than you might think, and our stories often share eerily similar details. The thing that haunts me most isn't the attack itself. It's the fact that it could have killed me easily but chose not to. Was it just trying to scare me away, defending its territory? Or was there some other reason? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. If you're reading this and thinking about a solo camping trip in remote areas, especially around central Washington, please reconsider, or at least take precautions. Go with a group, carry emergency supplies, make sure someone knows exactly where you'll be. And most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I've attached a photo of my medical report and the police report for those who might doubt my story. Editor's note, files no longer available. The gash on my head has healed, but I still have a scar. It's a constant reminder that there are things out there we don't understand, things that defy our modern rational explanations. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that figure I saw through my binoculars, how it moved with such purpose, such intelligence. I think about how it used those rocks as weapons, how it herded me along the trail. And I wonder how many other people have similar stories they're afraid to share. I'm not afraid to share mine anymore, because maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone else trust their gut when something doesn't feel right. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also mysterious and sometimes dangerous. Some places are still wild, and maybe they're meant to stay that way. I still get chills thinking about what happened during our family trip to Colorado last October. My wife Sarah and I had been planning this getaway for months. Just a simple weekend in a mountain cabin with our kids, Emma, 9, and Lucas, 7. We're from Kansas City, and the kids had never seen real mountains before. The cabin looked perfect on the rental website, secluded, surrounded by pine forest, with views of the Rockies that seemed straight out of a postcard. It was about 20 miles outside of Pagosa Springs, up an unmarked Forest Service road. We arrived Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The temperature was already dropping fast, that sharp mountain cold that cuts right through your jacket. The cabin was exactly what we expected, a 2-story A-frame with a wraparound deck, maybe built in the 80s but well maintained. The property manager had left the porch light on, and the key under the mat as promised. The first weird thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, I expected peaceful, but this was different. No birds, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just this heavy silence that seemed to press in on your ears. Sarah said I was being dramatic, but I could tell the kids felt it too. They stayed unusually close while we unloaded the car. We got settled in pretty quickly. The cabin was cozy inside, all knotty pine walls and rustic furniture, with a big stone fireplace in the living room. I got a fire going while Sarah made hot chocolate for everyone. By 8 p.m., we were all gathered around the coffee table playing Uno, and that unsettling feeling from earlier had mostly faded. That's when we heard it, this deep, heavy crunch of footsteps in the frozen ground outside. At first, I assumed it was an elk, or maybe a black bear. We'd been warned that both were common in the area, but these steps were different. They were too deliberate, too rhythmic, and they were slow, like whatever was making them was taking its time, circling the cabin. "Daddy, what's that?" Emma whispered, her cards forgotten in her hands. I tried to sound confident. "Just some wildlife, sweetheart. Remember how the property manager said we might see some elk?" But I didn't believe it myself. The footsteps continued, accompanied now by the sound of branches snapping. Not small twigs, but thick branches that made sharp, violent cracks in the silence. Whatever was out there was big. Really big. Sarah caught my eye, and I could see she was thinking the same thing. This wasn't normal animal behavior. We tried to continue the game, but none of us were really playing anymore. All our attention was focused on those footsteps, which continued for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes before finally fading into the forest. We put the kids to bed in the upstairs loft around 9:30. They were scared, but we convinced them it was just forest animals. Sarah and I stayed up for a while longer, sitting in silence by the fire, straining to hear any more sounds from outside. Around 11, we headed to bed ourselves in the main floor bedroom, but I don't think either of us slept much. The next morning started normally enough. The sun was bright, and in the daylight, it was easier to dismiss our fears from the night before. That changed when I went out to get some firewood from the pile on the side of the cabin. The ground was covered in a light frost, and in that frost were footprints, not elk tracks, not bear prints. These were clearly feet, humanoid feet, but massive. Each print was easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They formed a path that circled the entire cabin, exactly matching the pattern of the footsteps we'd heard. My hands were shaking as I took photos with my phone. The prints were so clear you could see individual toe impressions. But what really got to me were the stride lengths. Each step was at least 6 feet apart. Whatever made these would have had to be incredibly tall. That wasn't all. The deck railings on the back side of the cabin had deep gouges in them, about 8 feet up. They looked like claw marks, but larger and deeper than any bear could make. Some of the marks had actually splintered the thick wooden posts. I didn't want to scare the kids, so I called Sarah out alone to see. Her face went pale. "We should leave," she said immediately. "Pack up and go home." I agreed, but then we heard the kids laughing inside, excited about the snow-capped mountains visible from their loft window. We'd promised them this vacation for months. After some discussion, we decided to stay one more night, but agreed to leave first thing Sunday morning instead of staying through Sunday night as planned. That day was tense. We took the kids on a short hike, but stayed close to the cabin and kept checking over our shoulders. Every snapping twig made us jump. The weird silence from the day before persisted. No birds, no squirrels, nothing moving in the forest around us. As dusk approached, that feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I swear I could feel eyes on us from the tree line. The kids picked up on our anxiety and stayed close, not even asking to play outside like they usually would. We were all in the living room after dinner when Emma suddenly froze, staring out the picture window that faced the forest. "There's someone out there," she whispered. I looked where she was pointing and felt my blood turn to ice. About 50 yards from the cabin, partially hidden behind a large pine tree, was a massive dark figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. In the fading light, I could make out broad shoulders and a large, somewhat pointed head that sat directly on those shoulders, no neck visible. The proportions were all wrong for a human or any animal I knew of. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. The figure remained perfectly still, just watching. Then it shifted slightly, and in that movement, I caught a glimpse of reddish-brown fur catching the last rays of sunlight. "Everybody upstairs, now!" My voice was barely a whisper, but they all moved immediately. We hurried to the loft, and I made sure all the lights were off. From the upstairs windows, we could see more of the property, and what we saw made my heart nearly stop. There wasn't just one figure anymore. A second one, even larger than the first, had emerged from the trees on the other side of the clearing. They were moving with that same deliberate slowness we'd heard the night before, but now we could see them. Their movements were eerily smooth despite their size, and they seemed to be coordinating somehow, positioning themselves on opposite sides of the cabin. The kids were crying silently, and Sarah was holding them tight. I was trying to figure out what to do. We were about 45 minutes from the nearest town, down a dark Forest Service road. Running to the car suddenly seemed much more dangerous than staying put. That's when the smell hit us. This overwhelming, putrid odor like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Seconds later, something heavy bumped against the cabin wall, making the whole structure shudder. We spent the next 4 hours huddled in the dark loft, listening to those things move around the cabin. They never made any aggressive moves to break in, but they didn't leave either. They would occasionally bump the walls or rake their claws across the siding, creating this horrible scraping sound that set our teeth on edge. The whole time, that awful smell lingered. Around 2 a.m., everything went quiet again. We waited another hour before I got up the courage to look outside. The clearing was empty. No massive figures, no movement in the trees. Even that oppressive silence had lifted somewhat. I could hear a light wind moving through the pine needles. We were packed and in the car by 4 a.m., driving way too fast down that mountain road. The sun was just coming up when we hit the highway, and we didn't stop until we were halfway back to Kansas. I reported what happened to the property manager, but I could tell she didn't believe me, even with the photos of the footprints and claw marks. She said she'd never had any similar reports from that cabin. It's been 6 months, and I still haven't made sense of what happened that weekend. I've researched every large animal native to Colorado, and nothing matches what we saw. The only things that come close are Bigfoot encounters, but I'd always dismissed those as stories and hoaxes. Now, I'm not so sure. The worst part is the feeling that they were toying with us. They could have easily broken into that cabin if they wanted to, but instead, they just watched and waited, like they were studying us or playing some kind of game. Sometimes I wonder if we were just lucky, or if there was some other reason they decided to leave us alone. We don't do mountain vacations anymore. The kids still have nightmares sometimes, and honestly, so do I. I've never felt so small and vulnerable as I did that night, realizing that we weren't at the top of the food chain after all. There are things in those mountains that defy explanation, and sometimes I think they're better left alone. What happened last summer in the Shasta Trinity National Forest still gives me nightmares, and I finally feel ready to write about it. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. It was supposed to be a simple 4-day camping trip with my closest friends, me, Jake, Sarah, and Mike. We'd been planning it for months, trying to escape the California heat and our soul-crushing office jobs. I'd grown up camping, but this was different. Looking back, I wish we'd stuck to the more popular campgrounds. We arrived at the trailhead around 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. The parking lot was empty except for our car, which should have been our first warning sign. The area was beautiful, though, tall pines stretching endlessly into the distance, that crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. We shouldered our packs and started the 3-mile hike to Crystal Lake, where we planned to set up base camp. The weird stuff started about an hour into our hike. We were taking a water break when Sarah mentioned she felt like something was watching us. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? Yeah, that one. We laughed it off, city folks getting spooked by nature and all that. But thinking back, our laughter sounded forced, like we were trying to convince ourselves everything was normal. We reached the lake around noon. It was gorgeous. Crystal clear water surrounded by dense forest, with Mount Shasta looming in the distance. We found a perfect spot about 50 yards from the water's edge, with enough clearing for our 2 tents and a fire pit. Mike and Jake got to work setting up camp while Sarah and I collected firewood. That's when I noticed the first really strange thing. Some of the trees near our campsite had weird marks on them, not like bear scratches, which I'd seen before. These were different. They were about 8 feet up the trunk, with 5 distinct lines running parallel to each other, deep into the bark. They looked fresh. I called Jake over to look at them, and he suggested it might be from some logging equipment. But we were miles from any logging sites, and these marks, they looked deliberate. The rest of the afternoon was normal enough. We swam in the lake, made dinner, and sat around the campfire telling stories. But as the sun started setting, the forest changed. You know how woods usually come alive at night with cricket sounds and owls? This was the opposite. Everything went quiet. Too quiet. Around 9 p.m., we heard it for the first time. Heavy footsteps moving through the forest behind our camp. Not like a deer or even a bear. These were slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. We all froze, staring at each other across the fire. Mike grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam just disappeared into the darkness. Then came the smell. If you've ever been near a landfill on a hot day, mix that with wet dog and something metallic like blood. It was overwhelming. Sarah started gagging, and I felt my own stomach turn. The footsteps moved around the perimeter of our camp just out of sight. We could hear branches snapping under its weight. That's when we heard the sound that still haunts my dreams. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, like you could feel it in your chest more than hear it. Then it turned into this weird moaning howl that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It wasn't quite a wolf, wasn't quite a bear. It was something else entirely. The howl echoed across the lake, and in the distance, we heard another one answer. We spent the next hour huddled around the fire, barely speaking. The footsteps and sounds eventually faded, but none of us slept much that night. We took turns keeping watch, though honestly, I'm not sure what we would have done if something had actually approached camp. The next morning, we found the tracks. Real, distinct footprints in the soft earth near our campsite. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and human-like, but not human. The stride length between them was massive, like 4, 5 feet apart. I took photos, but they came out blurry and don't do justice to what we saw. We decided to follow the tracks, which in retrospect was probably the dumbest decision of our lives. They led us deeper into the forest, away from the lake. The vegetation got thicker, and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. The tracks went on for about a quarter mile before suddenly stopping at a clearing. The clearing is where things got really messed up. The grass was all matted down in a huge circle, like something had been sleeping there. There were more of those claw marks on the trees, but fresher this time. Sap was still oozing from some of them. And the smell. That same horrific smell from the night before, but stronger. But what really got to me were the bones. Scattered around the clearing were dozens of small animal bones. Rabbits, deer, maybe some raccoons. They weren't old and weathered either. Some still had bits of meat on them. Sarah started crying when she saw them, and Mike looked like he was going to be sick. That's when we heard the footsteps again, in broad daylight. The sound came from behind us, and it was close. Way too close. None of us turned around. We just stood there, frozen, listening to something massive moving through the underbrush. A branch snapped maybe 20 feet behind us, and that's when we ran. I don't remember much about that run back to camp. It's all a blur of branches whipping past my face and my lungs burning. I know we heard it pursuing us, not running, but moving steadily, methodically, like it knew we couldn't escape. The whole time there was this deep, rumbling sound, like a growl, but deeper than any animal should be able to make. We made it back to camp and started packing our stuff as fast as we could. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, standing between 2 trees at the edge of the clearing. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was massive and covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the face that gets me. It looked almost human, but wrong. The eyes were too intelligent, too aware. It was watching us with this terrible intelligence that made my blood run cold. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pointed, but by the time she looked, it had melted back into the forest. But we could still hear it moving around us, circling the camp. We abandoned half our gear, grabbing only what we could carry easily, and practically ran the 3 miles back to the car. The whole hike back, we could hear them, because now there were definitely more than one, moving parallel to us through the woods. They never showed themselves again, but they were there. The howls echoed through the trees, closer than before, almost like they were talking to each other. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses of movement through the trees, or see branches moving with no wind. We made it back to the car just as the sun was starting to set. The drive home was silent. What could we even say? We all saw it. We all experienced it, but none of us could explain it. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters in that area. Turns out there have been dozens of reports over the years. Hikers going missing, strange sounds in the night, massive footprints found in remote areas. I still camp, but never in that part of California. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear that deep rumbling howl, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed another night. The weird thing is, none of us ever reported it officially. What would we say? Who would believe us? But I know what we saw. I know what followed us through those woods, and I know that whatever it was intelligent enough to hunt us, but for some reason chose not to. The marks on those trees still bother me the most. They weren't random animal scratches. They were messages, warnings maybe, or territory markers. Sometimes I think about going back with better cameras, more supplies, maybe some tracking equipment. But then I remember those eyes, that terrible intelligence behind them, and I realize some things are better left alone. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I wake up and try to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But then I remember the photos of those footprints on my phone, even if they're too blurry to make out clearly. I remember the smell, the sounds, and most of all, that face through the trees. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's not just some undiscovered animal. It's something else entirely, and it knows we're here. I've been a forest ranger in Montana for almost 15 years now, and what happened last month still keeps me up at night. I'm writing this down because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. I work at one of the more remote fire lookout towers in the Kootenai National Forest. It's an old-school setup, just a small cabin on stilts with windows on all sides, about 40 feet up in the air. Been doing the night shifts there for the past 3 years without any issues. Sure, you get the occasional bear or mountain lion, but nothing that ever really bothered me. I'm used to the solitude, the quiet, and all the usual forest sounds, or at least I thought I was. It started on a Tuesday night in late September. The weather had been unusually warm for that time of year, and the fire risk was still pretty high. I remember checking the temperature gauge. It was hovering around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, even after sunset, which was weird for Montana that time of year. I had just settled in for my shift, doing my usual routine, checking the radio equipment, updating the logbook, and scanning the horizons with my binoculars. Around 10 p.m., I noticed something odd. There were these large rocks placed in a rough semicircle about 50 yards from the base of my tower. Now, I know every inch of the ground around my station. It's part of my job. Those rocks hadn't been there during my last shift 2 days ago. We're talking about rocks that must have weighed at least 200 pounds each, and there were 7 of them. They weren't just randomly scattered, they were deliberately placed, evenly spaced, like some kind of marker or boundary. I radioed in to check if any of the day shift guys had reported seeing anyone in the area. Nothing. No hikers, no maintenance crews, nobody who could have moved those rocks. I thought about going down to check them out, but something in my gut told me to stay put. When you've worked in the wilderness as long as I have, you learn to trust that feeling. Around midnight, the wind died completely. I mean dead still, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was this deep, resonant sound, almost like someone humming, but much lower than any human voice I've ever heard. It seemed to come from the tree line about 200 yards to the northeast of my position. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I grabbed my spotlight and swept it across the trees, but the beam only reached about halfway to where I thought the sound came from. I kept telling myself it was probably just an elk or maybe a bear, but I've heard every animal sound these forests can make, and this wasn't any of them. It was too deliberate, too controlled. The sound came again about an hour later, this time from a different direction, more to the west. It was closer now, and I could feel it in my chest, like when you stand too close to a subwoofer. That's when I noticed the movement. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the clouds moving across the moon, but there weren't any clouds that night. The stars were crystal clear. Something was moving between the trees, something big. Whatever it was staying just at the edge of where my light could reach, like it knew exactly where that boundary was. I'm not easily spooked. You can't do this job if you are. But watching those shadows move, hearing that sound, it was different from anything I'd experienced before. I kept my rifle close, but honestly, I'm not sure it would have made any difference if whatever was out there decided to come closer. Around 2 a.m., I heard something heavy moving through the undergrowth below the tower. The whole structure creaked slightly, like something had bumped one of the support poles. I killed all the lights in the cabin and sat there in the dark, just listening. The footsteps, and they were definitely footsteps, were slow and deliberate, circling the base of the tower. They didn't sound like a bear or an elk. The spacing was all wrong, too far apart and too rhythmic. I forced myself to look down through the floor-level observation window. The moon was bright enough that I could make out something moving below, but my brain couldn't quite process what I was seeing. The shadow it cast was huge, at least 8 feet tall, but it moved with an uncanny smoothness. I caught a glimpse of what looked like an arm, way too long and covered in something dark, reaching out toward one of the support beams. That's when my radio crackled to life with static, making me jump so hard I knocked over my coffee thermos. The noise seemed to startle whatever was down there too, because I heard it move away quickly, much more quickly than something that size should be able to move. The brush cracked and swayed as it retreated into the forest. When dawn finally started to break, I forced myself to go down and check the area. What I found still makes my hands shake when I think about it. There were footprints in the soft earth around the tower base, huge footprints, easily 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. But what really got to me was the pattern. They were unmistakably bipedal tracks, with 5 distinct toe impressions in each print. Near the tree line where I'd heard the first sound, I found an area where something large had clearly been watching the tower. The grass was matted down in a rough oval shape, about 7 feet long, and there were these weird marks in the bark of a nearby tree, about 8 feet up. 5 parallel grooves that looked like they'd been made by something with claws or extremely strong fingers. But the thing that really makes me question everything I know was what I found next to one of those deliberately placed rocks. There was this small pile of pine cones, arranged in what I can only describe as a deliberate pattern, 3 rows of 3, perfectly aligned. This wasn't some animal's food cache. This was something else entirely. I've seen bears stand up. I've tracked mountain lions. I've dealt with every predator these woods have to offer. None of them do anything like this. None of them move rocks into patterns. None of them make sounds like what I heard. And none of them leave tracks like what I found. I took photos of everything with my phone, but when I checked later, most of them came out too blurry or dark to make out any detail. The one clear shot I got of a footprint looks distorted somehow, like the camera couldn't quite focus on it properly. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me this story a month ago, I would have thought they were making it up, or had too much to drink on their shift. I requested a transfer to day shifts after that night. Told my supervisor it was for personal reasons. The thing is, I can handle the normal dangers of this job, the fires, the wild animals, the occasional lost hiker, but whatever was out there that night wasn't normal. It was intelligent, it was watching me, and somehow that makes it so much worse. The rocks are still there, by the way. Nobody has moved them, and nobody seems to know how they got there. Sometimes, when I drive past that tower during the day, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something watching me. And on really quiet nights, when the wind dies down, I swear I can still hear that deep, resonant humming, even through the closed windows of my house, miles away from that tower. I don't know what was out there that night. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know this. Those woods are different now. Something is in there that doesn't fit into any category I know. Something that thinks and plans and watches. And sometimes, late at night, I can't shake the feeling that it knows exactly who I am, and that one day it might decide to pay me another visit. I've been hesitating to share this for months now, but I need to get this off my chest. My wife Sarah and I used to be avid fishing enthusiasts. We'd go camping and fishing almost every other weekend during the warmer months. But after what happened at Priest Lake in Idaho last September, neither of us has touched our fishing gear. They're just collecting dust in the garage now, and honestly, I don't know if we'll ever use them again. We had been planning this particular trip for weeks. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and the kind of gentle breeze that makes fall fishing in Idaho absolutely perfect. We chose a more remote spot on the eastern shore of Priest Lake, about 2 miles down an unmarked trail. We'd heard from some locals at the bait shop that the fishing was incredible there, especially for lake trout. The guy behind the counter mentioned that not many people ventured to that particular spot because of the rough trail, but that just made it more appealing to us. We'd always preferred the quieter, more secluded areas. We parked our truck at the small dirt lot near the trailhead around 2 p.m. The hike in was beautiful. The aspens were just starting to turn golden, and there was that crisp fall smell in the air. It took us about an hour and a half to reach our spot, carrying our tent, fishing gear, and enough supplies for 3 days. The spot was even better than we'd hoped, a small clearing about 50 feet from the shoreline, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. Setting up camp was routine for us. We'd done it countless times before, but something felt off. I can't explain it exactly, but there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. You know that sensation when you feel like someone's watching you? It was like that, but stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the tree line while hammering in the tent stakes. Sarah felt it too. I could tell by the way she kept scanning the trees while we were setting up our gear. She's usually the more level-headed one between us, so seeing her on edge made me even more uneasy. But we tried to shake it off. We'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that sometimes your mind plays tricks on you, especially in unfamiliar surroundings. By around 4:30 p.m., we had everything set up and decided to try some evening fishing. The lake was beautiful, perfectly still, reflecting the clouds like a mirror. We caught a couple of decent-sized trout, but I couldn't focus. That feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself staring into the dense forest behind us instead of watching my line. The sun started setting around 7 p.m., and that's when things began to get truly unsettling. We were cleaning our fish at the campsite when we heard the first strange sound, a deep, throaty exhale from somewhere in the trees. At first, I tried to rationalize it as a deer or elk, but it was too deep, too wrong. Sarah grabbed my arm and I could feel her trembling. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, trying to appear calmer than I felt. We quickly finished cleaning the fish and got a fire going. The flames provided some comfort, but they also created dancing shadows in the surrounding forest that made everything more ominous. We cooked our fish in near silence, both of us straining to hear any unusual sounds over the crackling of the fire. Around 9 p.m. we heard it again, that same deep breathing sound, but closer this time. It was followed by the distinct crack of a large branch breaking, like something heavy was moving through the forest. This wasn't a deer or elk. Whatever was out there was big, and it was moving deliberately. Sarah suggested we get in the tent, and I agreed. We quickly cleaned up, making sure no food was left out that might attract bears, though deep down I knew this wasn't bear behavior. Inside the tent, we lay fully clothed on top of our sleeping bags, listening intently to every sound from outside. The next few hours were the longest of my life. The breathing sounds continued intermittently, sometimes seeming to circle our campsite. We could hear heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate ever so slightly. At one point, something large moved past our tent, so close that the fabric brushed against it. Sarah had her hand clamped over her mouth to stay quiet, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Around 2 a.m., everything went quiet. The normal forest sounds, the crickets, the occasional owl, had been absent all night, but now even the heavy footsteps and breathing had stopped. After about 30 minutes of silence, I worked up the courage to peek outside the tent. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see our immediate surroundings. What I saw made my blood run cold. Our campsite was different. The chairs we'd left by the fire had been moved, not knocked over like an animal would do, but deliberately placed in different positions. The cooler we'd secured in the tree, bear precaution, was still there, but the rope had been untied and retied in a different spot. But the worst part was the footprints. In the soft mud near the lake's edge, there were clear impressions, huge footprints, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were fresh, the water still seeping into the deepest parts. I quickly took a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. I ducked back into the tent and showed Sarah the pictures. We didn't say a word. We didn't have to. We both knew we needed to get out of there, but we also knew that whatever had made those prints could still be nearby, watching us. We decided to wait until first light. Those next few hours were torture. We lay there, barely breathing, listening to every tiny sound. Occasionally, we'd hear something moving in the forest, but it stayed further away now. As soon as the sky began to lighten, around 5:30 a.m., we started packing up. We'd never broken down camp so quickly. We left a few non-essential items behind, not wanting to spend an extra minute there. The hike back was terrifying. That feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Every few minutes, we'd hear branches breaking in the forest parallel to the trail, always just far enough away that we couldn't see anything through the trees, but close enough to let us know it was following us. We practically jogged the whole way, our camping gear bouncing awkwardly on our backs. About halfway back to the car, we found more footprints crossing the trail. These were different. They showed whatever it was had been running. The stride length was enormous, easily 6-7 feet between prints. Sarah started crying when she saw them, and I felt like throwing up. We finally made it back to our truck around 7:30 a.m. As I was unlocking the doors, we heard one final sound from the forest, a long, low vocalization that I can only describe as a mix between a moan and a deep growl. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, but almost seemed curious? I don't know. We jumped in the truck and didn't stop driving until we were back in Coeur d'Alene. We did report the incident to the local Forest Service office, but I could tell by their faces they didn't really believe us, even when I showed them the photos. Looking at the pictures now, the prints don't seem as clear as they did in person. They're shadowy and a bit blurred, like most photos of unexplained things are. But Sarah and I know what we experienced. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters in the area, and there are quite a few. Some people have suggested it was a Bigfoot, and while I would have laughed at that before, I'm not laughing now. I don't know what followed us that night, but it was intelligent, it was huge, and it fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. Our fishing gear is still in the garage, probably going to stay there. Sarah suggested selling it last week, and I'm considering it. The thing is, it's not just that we're afraid to go fishing in remote places now. We've lost the desire entirely. That night changed something in us. The wilderness doesn't feel peaceful anymore. Every time I look into a dense forest, I can't help but wonder, what's watching me from just beyond those trees? I know this all sounds crazy. Before this happened, I would have been the first person to dismiss stories like this. I was the guy who always had a logical explanation for everything. But now I know there are things in our forests that defy explanation. Things that make you question everything you thought you knew about what's possible and what isn't. The only reason I'm sharing this now is that I needed to tell someone who might understand or who might have experienced something similar. My friends and family have been supportive, but I can see the doubt in their eyes when we talk about it. But I know what we experienced was real. Those footprints were real. That feeling of being watched was real. That deep, rhythmic breathing was real. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear that final sound it made as we were leaving, that long, low moan that seemed to hang in the air. In my dreams, I'm back in that tent, listening to those heavy footsteps circling closer and closer. Sarah says she has the same dreams. We've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, though who would follow us for 2 miles into the wilderness just to scare us? Maybe it was some undiscovered animal, but what animal unties and reties ropes, or deliberately moves chairs? Maybe we both somehow imagined the whole thing, but how do you explain the footprints, the photos? In the end, I guess it doesn't matter what it was. What matters is that it changed us, changed how we view the world, changed our relationship with nature, changed what we believe is possible. I used to think I knew what was out there in the wilderness. Now, I'm not so sure. And maybe that uncertainty, that knowing that we don't really know what's out there, is the scariest part of all. I've been hiking and camping in remote areas for over 15 years now, but what happened to me last summer in Wyoming's Bighorn National Forest has completely changed how I approach solo hiking. I'm still trying to make sense of it, and even now, my hands get shaky when I think about that night. I'd planned this particular hike meticulously, a challenging 3-day loop trail that would take me through some pretty isolated terrain. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, so the solitude didn't bother me. In fact, I usually preferred it. The weather forecast was perfect, and I had all my usual gear, my trusty one-person tent, sleeping bag rated for the mountain temperatures, enough food and water, emergency supplies, you know, the works. The trail started out normally enough. I got an early start around 7 a.m., wanting to cover good ground before setting up camp. The morning was crisp, with that clean mountain air that just makes you feel alive. The trail wasn't particularly well marked, but I had my GPS and maps, and I was making good progress. It was around 2 p.m. when things started feeling off. I'd been hiking steadily, focusing on my footsteps and the rhythm of my breathing, when I noticed something weird. You know how when you're hiking, you get into this sort of meditative state with the sound of your own footsteps? Well, I started hearing what sounded like an echo of my steps, but slightly delayed. At first, I thought it was just the acoustics of the forest playing tricks on me. But then I realized the sound was too heavy, too deliberate to be an echo. I stopped. The extra footsteps continued for a split second after I'd stopped moving. Then silence. My heart started racing. I turned around slowly, scanning the dense forest on either side of the trail. Nothing. Just trees, undergrowth, and the occasional bird call. I stood there for what felt like 5 minutes, barely breathing, just listening. When I couldn't hear anything unusual, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and continued hiking. But it happened again. And again. Each time I'd stop, the phantom footsteps would continue for just a fraction of a second too long. I started taking random pauses, trying to catch whatever was making the sound. Nothing. Every time I looked back, there was nothing there. But the moment I'd start walking again, after a few minutes, those heavy footsteps would return. By late afternoon, my nerves were shot. I'd planned to hike another couple of miles, but I decided to make camp early, choosing a small clearing about 50 yards off the trail. I needed to get my tent set up before dark, and honestly, I thought having a secure space might help calm my nerves. That's when I noticed the smell. If you've ever smelled a dead animal in the woods, imagine that, but mixed with something else, something musky and sour that made my stomach turn. It wasn't constant. It came in waves with the breeze. I've encountered bear, elk, and all sorts of wildlife before, but this smell was different. Wrong, somehow. I got my tent set up as quickly as possible, trying to ignore how my hands were shaking. The sun was setting, and the forest was getting eerily quiet. No bird calls, no squirrels, nothing. Just that occasional rancid smell drifting through. I forced myself to eat some trail mix and beef jerky, though my appetite was gone. I kept my bear spray close and my hunting knife closer. Around 9 p.m., I was in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself to get some rest. The forest was pitch black now, and the silence was deafening. That's when I heard it. Heavy breathing. Not like a person who's been exercising, but deep, rhythmic breaths that sounded like they were coming from something massive. It seemed to be circling my campsite, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see anything when I shined my flashlight through the tent walls. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, clutching my bear spray. The breathing would move around, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but never leaving completely. Then came the footsteps again, but this time they were slow and deliberate, circling my tent. Whatever it was big enough that I could feel the vibrations through the ground. Around 2 a.m., yes, I'd been awake that whole time, things escalated. My tent suddenly shook violently, like something had brushed against it, but not at ground level. Whatever hit my tent had struck it at least 7 feet up. I nearly screamed, but managed to clamp my hand over my mouth. The shaking happened again, and this time I heard what I can only describe as a low, rumbling growl, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more resonant, and seemed to come from way above ground level. I was certain I was about to die. I'd dealt with bears before, but this felt completely different. Bears don't stalk you for hours, they don't pace around your camp all night, and they certainly don't reach up 7 feet to shake your tent. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The breathing stopped. The footsteps stopped. Even that horrible smell dissipated. I lay there, shaking, until the first light of dawn started to creep through my tent walls. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent, what I saw made my blood run cold. All around my campsite in the soft earth were footprints, but not animal tracks. These were bipedal prints, easily 16 inches long and incredibly deep, like whatever made them was massively heavy. They formed a perfect circle around my tent, about 15 feet out, and there were broken branches on the trees above my tent, branches that were 8, 9 feet off the ground. I packed up my camp in record time, hands trembling so badly I could barely roll up my sleeping bag. I practically ran back to my car, taking a shorter route than I'd planned. The whole time I felt like I was being watched. But I didn't hear those extra footsteps again. I've spent months trying to rationalize what happened that night. I've been in the backcountry hundreds of times, encountered all sorts of wildlife, dealt with plenty of scary situations. But nothing comes close to explaining what I experienced. The footsteps that mimicked mine, the impossible height of whatever shook my tent, those massive footprints. It all defies logical explanation. I still go hiking, but never alone anymore, and never in that part of Wyoming. Some people have suggested it might have been a bear, or even other hikers playing a prank, but they weren't there. They didn't hear those breathing sounds, or feel the ground shake with each footstep, or see those impossibly large tracks in the morning light. I don't know what was out there that night, and part of me doesn't want to know, but I do know this. There are things in our forests that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. And sometimes the best thing you can do is accept that you'll never really know what happened, while making damn sure you never put yourself in a position to experience it again. I'd had a pretty rough day at work. I'm a veterinary assistant, and by the time I got home at 6 p.m., my head was pounding. I just needed to clear my mind, you know. Living next to the forest, I often take walks on this trail that starts about 200 feet from my backyard. I've probably walked it hundreds of times, even at night. I know. Not the smartest thing for a 23-year-old woman to do alone, but this is a small town where everyone knows everyone. Nothing ever happens here. It was around 8:30 p.m. when I decided to head out. The sun had already set, but there was still a bit of light in the sky, that weird bluish twilight that makes everything look kind of hazy. I grabbed my phone, 92% battery I remember checking, put on my favorite grey hoodie, and headed out. The temperature was in the mid-50s, pretty typical for early spring in Michigan. The first 10 minutes of my walk were completely normal. The trail I take is well maintained, about 6 feet wide, with dense forest on both sides. There's this old wooden bridge about half a mile in that crosses Miller Creek. It's usually my turning point when I walk at night. I was approaching the bridge just thinking about work stuff when something felt off. You know that feeling when you're home alone and suddenly feel like someone's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times worse because I was actually alone in the woods. I stopped walking and pulled out my earbuds. I hadn't even turned on any music yet. The forest was quieter than usual, like unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy ones, coming from somewhere in the trees to my left. They weren't regular human footsteps either. They were too heavy, too spread apart. At first I tried to convince myself it was just a deer. We get lots of deer around here, but deer don't walk like that. I started walking again, faster this time, and the footsteps matched my pace. They stayed parallel to me, just inside the tree line where I couldn't quite see. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was about 50 feet from the bridge when this sound came from the woods. It was like a cross between a grunt and a growl, but deeper than any animal I've ever heard at the clinic. It seemed to come from something big. Really big. I froze. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I was terrified that running would make whatever it was chase me. That's when I saw the shadow. It moved between two trees about 30 feet into the forest. Even in the dim light, I could tell it was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, broad, and definitely walking on 2 legs. The shape was all wrong for a bear. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped my phone when I turned on the flashlight. I swept the beam toward where I'd seen the shadow, and for a split second, I wish I hadn't. I caught a glimpse of something dark and massive moving behind a thick pine tree. What hit me hardest wasn't the size, but the way it moved. It was deliberate, almost human-like, but not quite right. That's when I ran. I've never run so fast in my life. The thing in the woods ran too. I could hear the thundering footsteps keeping pace with me, branches snapping, that awful grunting sound getting closer. The whole time, it stayed just inside the tree line, like it was herding me down the trail. I don't really remember most of the run home. I know I jumped over fallen logs that normally I'd walk around. I know I stumbled at least twice, but somehow kept my balance. The entire time, those heavy footsteps stayed with me. They were so powerful I could feel the impacts through the ground. When I finally burst out of the forest near my house, the footsteps stopped. Just stopped. Like whatever it was wouldn't follow me into the open. I ran straight inside, locked every door and window, and spent the next hour just sitting in my bathroom, shaking. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I do. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I'd think they were making it up or had watched too many horror movies. But I know what I experienced. I know what I saw. And I keep thinking about how many times I've walked that trail alone at night, completely unaware that something was out there watching. The worst part, the nightmares. Every night since then, I dream about being back on that trail. Sometimes I'm running, sometimes I'm frozen in place. But in every dream, that thing catches up to me, and right before I wake up in a cold sweat, I see its face. I can never remember the details when I wake up, just this overwhelming sense of wrongness, like my brain is trying to protect me from the memory. I've tried researching similar encounters in my area. There are a few vague stories on local forums about strange noises in the Huron forest, and some old newspaper clippings about unexplained livestock deaths in the 90s, but nothing that matches what I experienced. I haven't told many people about this. My mom thinks I just saw a bear, even though I've seen plenty of bears and know that's not what this was. My best friend suggested I was just tired and stressed from work and let my imagination run wild. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's a logical explanation for everything that happened that night, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that something followed me on that trail, something that shouldn't exist, something that was intelligent enough to stay just out of sight, something that seemed to know exactly how far it could push before backing off. I still live here, still work at the same clinic, still see that trail from my backyard every day. But I haven't been back on it since that night, and I never will, at least not alone, and definitely not after dark. Sometimes when I'm getting ready for bed, I hear strange noises coming from the direction of the forest. They're probably just normal forest sounds that I never paid attention to before. Probably. But sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps pacing back and forth where the forest meets my backyard. And occasionally, when I look out my bedroom window at night, I catch a glimpse of something large moving in the shadows between the trees. I keep my curtains closed now. I don't know what followed me that night. I don't want to know, but I do know that there are things in these woods that we don't understand, things that probably should be left alone. I've lived next to this forest my whole life, but now it feels like a stranger, and one that's not entirely friendly. If you live near woods in Michigan, or really anywhere with dense forests, please be careful about walking alone at night. I used to think I was being paranoid when people warned me about going into the forest after dark. Now I know better. Some things are better left alone, and some walks aren't worth taking. What happened to my family during our camping trip last August in the Pisgah National Forest still gives me nightmares. I've always considered myself a rational person. I work in accounting, deal with numbers all day, and generally don't buy into paranormal stuff. But what we experienced that weekend, I just can't explain it. My wife Sarah and I had been planning this trip for weeks. Our kids, Tommy, 11, and Emma, 8, were getting too attached to their iPads and video games, so we thought a weekend of camping would do us all some good. We picked a spot along the Davidson River. It's usually pretty quiet there, especially if you hike about a mile past the main campground areas. I'd been there fishing a few times before, and the secluded spots are perfect for family camping. We arrived Friday afternoon around 3 p.m. The weather was perfect. Mid-70s, slight breeze, not a cloud in sight. We found this beautiful clearing about 30 feet from the riverbank, sheltered by these massive oak trees. The spot was ideal. Flat ground for the tents, plenty of dead wood nearby for the fire, and the gentle sound of the river in the background. The kids were actually excited, which was a nice change from their usual complaints about no Wi-Fi. Setting up camp took longer than expected because Tommy and Emma kept getting distracted by everything: bugs, weird-shaped sticks, fish jumping in the river. But by sunset, we had our 2 tents up, one for Sarah and me, one for the kids, a decent fire going, and we'd just finished eating the hot dogs and s'mores I'd promised them. Everything felt perfect, normal, safe. The first strange thing happened around 10 p.m. We were all sitting around the fire, and I was in the middle of telling this stupid ghost story about a haunted hiking trail, you know, the usual camping stuff, when we heard this splash from across the river. Not like a fish jumping, this was bigger, like someone had thrown a bowling ball into the water. I stopped mid-sentence and grabbed my flashlight. The beam only reached about halfway across the river. It was maybe 40 feet wide at that point. We heard another splash, closer this time, then another. It sounded like someone was throwing large rocks into the water, moving downstream. Probably some teenagers messing around, Sarah said, but something in her voice sounded uncertain. I told myself she was right, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. The splashes seemed too regular, too deliberate. Emma was scared and wanted to go to bed, so Sarah took the kids to their tent while I stayed up to keep an eye on things. The splashes continued for another 15 minutes or so, always moving downstream until they faded away completely. I sat there for another hour, telling myself I was being paranoid before finally turning in. Around 3 a.m., Tommy woke us up. He was shaking and crying, saying he needed to pee but was too scared to go outside. When I asked why, he just kept saying the giant was looking at our tent. Sarah tried to calm him down, saying it was just a dream, but he was adamant. Said he'd woken up to pee earlier and seen a huge dark shape standing between the trees, watching their tent. Said it was like a really tall, hairy man, but bigger. I grabbed my flashlight and walked Tommy to a spot near the tents to pee. The whole time I kept scanning the tree line with my light. Everything looked normal, but the forest felt different. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times worse. The air felt heavy, and there was this smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. We got back in our tents, but none of us slept much after that. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made my heart race. Around dawn, Emma started whispering urgently to Tommy in their tent. I heard Tommy say, "You saw it too?" before Sarah shushed them. As soon as it was light enough, I got out to start breakfast, trying to act normal. That's when I saw them, the footprints. They were pressed into the mud along the riverbank, giant impressions that made my boots look tiny in comparison. Each print was easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was massive, like 5 feet apart. My hands were shaking as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led right past our campsite, not 20 feet from our tents. Whatever made them had walked right by us while we slept. There were also these weird marks on some of the trees, deep scratches about 8 feet up the trunks, like something huge had been marking its territory. I tried to keep calm for the kids' sake, made them pancakes on the camping stove, acted like everything was fine. But Sarah knew something was wrong. She kept giving me these looks, and I could tell she'd seen the prints too. We tried to have a normal day, went for a short hike, staying close to camp, did some fishing, built a rock dam in the shallow part of the river. But there was this tension in the air. Every time we heard a rustle in the bushes or a branch snap, we all froze. As the sun started to set, things got worse. The birds stopped singing way earlier than they should have. The forest got quiet, that unnatural kind of quiet that makes the hair on your neck stand up. We built up the fire extra big that night, and none of us wanted to go to bed. Emma kept pointing at the trees across the river, saying she saw eyes reflecting the firelight. But when I shined the flashlight there, nothing was there. Around 9 p.m. it started. First we heard this deep rumbling sound from across the river. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. It was so low you could feel it in your chest. Then the rocks started again, but this time they weren't just being thrown in the river. They were being thrown toward our camp. The first one splashed in the water about 10 feet from the bank. The next one hit the ground behind our tents. They weren't huge rocks, but they were big enough to hurt if they hit you. That's when Emma started crying, and honestly, I was close to it myself. Then we heard the footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps moving through the trees around our camp. Whatever it was circling us. The steps would stop occasionally, and we'd hear that deep rumbling sound again, closer each time. Sarah had the kids huddled close to her, and I was standing there with my pathetic little camping hatchet, trying to think of what to do. The breaking point came when we heard a tree crack, not a branch, a whole tree, about 50 yards behind our camp. It sounded like something massive had just pushed it over, Emma screamed. And that's when the growling got loud, really loud. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. I've never packed up camp so fast in my life. We left the tents, just grabbed the sleeping bags, our backpacks, and whatever food we could throw together. I picked up Emma, Sarah grabbed Tommy's hand, and we practically ran back to the trail, guided by our flashlights. The whole time, we could hear it moving parallel to us in the woods, breaking branches and making those awful sounds. The mile back to our car felt like 10. Every few minutes we'd hear crashes in the undergrowth, always just out of sight. The kids were crying quietly, and Sarah kept whispering prayers under her breath. I kept thinking about those footprints, imagining whatever made them catching up to us in the dark. When we finally reached the parking area, we threw everything in the car and got out of there as fast as we could. The whole drive home, we kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive following us on the road. We went back the next day, in broad daylight, to get our tents. Part of me hoped everything would look normal, that we'd all just freaked ourselves out over nothing. But the campsite was trashed. Both tents were torn apart, our camping chairs were broken, and there were those massive footprints everywhere. The ranger we reported it to just said there had been some unusual activity in the area lately and took some notes, but I could tell he didn't want to discuss it further. I've spent months trying to rationalize what happened that night. Bears don't throw rocks. Mountain lions don't leave 16-inch footprints, and nothing natural I know of stands that tall or makes those kinds of sounds. The kids still have nightmares, and we haven't been camping since. Sarah wants to pretend it never happened, but I can't forget it. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that deep, rumbling sound, and I wonder if whatever it was is still out there in those woods, waiting for the next family to make the mistake of camping too far from the main grounds. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had watched too many horror movies. But this happened. It was real. And the worst part is not knowing exactly what it was that terrorized us that night. Part of me wants answers, but a bigger part hopes I never find out. I've been fishing since I was old enough to hold a rod, but what happened that night in the Ocala National Forest changed everything for me. I'm still trying to make sense of it 6 months later, and my hands shake a bit just typing this out. I need to share this because it's eating me up inside, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. I'm a dedicated night fisherman, been doing it for over 15 years. There's something peaceful about being out there when everyone else is sleeping. The water's calmer, the fish are more active, and you get the whole place to yourself. Well, at least that's what I thought. It was mid-March, during that weird period when Florida nights are still cool enough to need a light jacket. I'd heard about this secluded spot from another fisherman at my local bait shop, a hidden gem in the forest where the bass grow huge because hardly anyone fishes there. He mentioned it was a bit tricky to get to, but the fishing was worth it. Should have known better than to go alone, but I've always been stubborn that way. I loaded up my old Ford F-150 with my usual gear, couple of fishing rods, tackle box, bait bucket, some nets, my Coleman lantern, and a few other essentials. Packed extra batteries for my headlamp and flashlight, some snacks, and a thermos of coffee. I'd planned to fish through the night since that's when the big ones usually bite. The drive there took longer than expected. I had to navigate through some pretty rough dirt roads, and my truck's suspension complained the whole way. By the time I found the spot, the sun was already setting. It was one of those small lakes, maybe 2, 3 acres, surrounded by dense cypress trees and saw palmettos. The kind of place that probably hasn't changed much in the last 100 years. I remember feeling uneasy as soon as I parked. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? Like that. But I brushed it off. Been fishing in remote spots hundreds of times before. What could be different about this one? Setting up took about an hour. I found a decent clearing near the water's edge and set up my chair and gear. The humidity was making everything damp, and there was this thick layer of mist hanging just above the water's surface. I got my net set up in a few promising spots and started fishing with my rod while waiting for them to do their work. The first few hours were actually pretty good. Caught a couple of decent-sized bass, nothing huge, but enough to keep me interested. The night was clear, and the quarter moon provided just enough light to see the basic outline of things. The only sounds were the usual chorus of frogs and crickets, with the occasional splash of fish jumping. It must have been around 1 a.m. when things started getting weird. I was about to check my nets when I first heard it, the sound of something heavy moving through the undergrowth behind me. Now, I'm used to the normal forest sounds, raccoons, possums, even the occasional deer. But this was different. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. I froze in my chair, my hand gripping my rod so tight my knuckles turned white. The movement stopped, and for a few seconds there was complete silence. Even the frogs and crickets had gone quiet. That's when I heard the breathing. It wasn't like any animal breathing I'd ever heard before. It was deep, rhythmic, and unsettlingly human-like, but too powerful, too loud. It sounded like it was coming from something big, really big. The breaths were slow and controlled, like whatever it was trying to be quiet, but couldn't quite manage it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I slowly reached for my flashlight, trying not to make any sudden movements. The breathing got closer, and I could hear twigs snapping under heavy weight. The sound of my zipper opening the pocket of my fishing vest seemed explosively loud in the quiet. When I finally got my flashlight, I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was making those sounds, but I knew I had to. I took a deep breath and spun around, clicking the flashlight on in one motion. What I saw in that brief moment before it moved will haunt me forever. About 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a cypress tree, was a massive dark figure. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The flashlight beam caught its eyes first. They reflected back with a reddish-orange glow, like a cat's eyes, but much larger and set much higher off the ground. The figure was broad-shouldered and covered in what looked like dark fur, but before I could make out any more details, it moved. The speed at which something that size could move was terrifying. In one fluid motion, it stepped behind the tree and deeper into the forest. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves marked its retreat, but it moved far more quietly than something that size should have been able to. I sat there paralyzed, flashlight beam still pointed where the figure had been, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But I've seen plenty of bears in my time fishing, and this wasn't like any bear I'd ever encountered. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I was terrified of moving. What if it was still out there watching? What if it was circling around behind me? Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I kept my flashlight scanning the tree line, looking for those eyes again. Eventually, my fear of staying outweighed my fear of moving. I started packing up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. That's when I noticed the smell, this powerful, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't identify. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I was about halfway through packing when I heard something splash in the water near one of my nets. The sound made me jump so bad I dropped my tackle box, spilling hooks and lures all over the ground. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, half expecting to see that figure in the water, but there was nothing there. Just ripples on the surface where something had disturbed the water. I left the spilled tackle, left the nets too. Some of my gear was probably worth a few $100s, but there was no way I was going to stay any longer or go any closer to the water. I grabbed my rods and what I could carry in one trip and practically ran to my truck. The walk back seemed 10 times longer than it had earlier. Every shadow looked like a massive figure, every tree branch reaching out to grab me. I kept hearing movement in the forest parallel to my path, like something was pacing me just out of sight. The smell followed me all the way to my truck. When I finally reached my vehicle, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I was throwing my gear in the back, I heard one final crash in the undergrowth, closer this time, and I swear I heard what sounded like a deep, guttural grunt. I didn't stick around to hear anything else. I drove home way too fast on those dirt roads, bottoming out my suspension more than once. It wasn't until I was back on the main highway that I finally felt safe enough to breathe normally. I kept checking my rearview mirror the whole way home, half expecting to see something following me. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I convinced myself to go back. Not alone. I brought my brother-in-law with me. Had to see it in the daylight, had to know I wasn't crazy. We found my scattered tackle, and my nets were shredded to pieces. But what really got me were the footprints. They were in the soft mud near the water's edge, where my nets had been. Massive prints, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. My brother-in-law took some photos on his phone, but they came out blurry and don't really show the scale of what we saw. We followed the tracks for a bit into the forest, but they disappeared into the denser vegetation. Found some broken branches high up on the trees, way higher than a bear could reach, and tufts of dark hair caught on some thorny bushes. The hair was coarse and long, unlike anything I'd seen before. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I won't fish alone anymore, especially at night. I stick to the popular spots now, where there are always other people around. Some folks I've told this to think I'm crazy, or that I imagined it all. Maybe they're right. Maybe the darkness and solitude played tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that something was out there that night, something that shouldn't exist. That musky smell still shows up in my nightmares. And sometimes when I'm fishing, even in crowded spots, I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for those glowing eyes. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters in the area. There are stories, more than you'd think, of similar experiences in the Florida forests. Most people are too embarrassed to talk about them publicly. I understand why. I almost didn't share this story either. I still fish, but something changed in me that night. There's a knowledge I can't unlearn, a certainty that we don't know everything about what lives in our forests. Sometimes, when I'm driving past wooded areas at night, I slow down and look into the darkness between the trees. Part of me hopes I'll never see those eyes again, but another part of me wishes I had proof, something concrete to validate what I experienced. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. All I know is that I'm not the same person who drove out to that secluded fishing spot 6 months ago. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. Some experiences change you forever. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you see in the darkness. It's the realization that what you saw might actually be real. What happened at that abandoned factory in Marion, Ohio, still haunts me. I've been urban exploring for over 6 years, and nothing like this has ever happened to me before. Even now, typing this makes my hands shake a bit. It was back in early March of this year. I'd been researching abandoned places in central Ohio and came across this old textile factory that shut down in the late 90s. The place looked perfect from the satellite views. Isolated enough to explore without interruption, but close enough to town that I could get there easily. It sat right at the edge of a dense woodland area, which I thought would make for some great photos, with all the trees framing the building. I went on a Tuesday morning. I always prefer weekday explorations, since there's less chance of running into other people. The weather was overcast but dry, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty typical for early spring in Ohio. I parked my car about a quarter-mile down the access road and walked the rest of the way, carrying my usual gear: camera, flashlight, backup flashlight, water bottle, and a small first aid kit. I've learned from experience to always be prepared. The factory was bigger than I expected. 3 stories of red brick with most windows either boarded up or broken. The loading dock area was completely overgrown with weeds pushing through the concrete, and there was this massive rusty door hanging half off its tracks. Nature was definitely reclaiming this place. The only way in was through a partially collapsed section near what must have been the employee entrance. Everything seemed normal at first, just your typical abandoned building stuff, peeling paint, graffiti, debris scattered everywhere. The ground floor was mostly empty, except for some old machinery parts and fallen ceiling tiles. The musty smell was strong, but not unusual for these places. I spent about an hour taking photos and documenting the layout. It wasn't until I reached the second floor that things started feeling wrong. The first thing I noticed was this weird dampness in the air. It wasn't raining, and there weren't any obvious water leaks, but the atmosphere felt heavy and wet. Then there was this smell, like wet dog, but much stronger and mustier. At first I thought maybe some strays had made their home up there, but this was different. More wild. I was photographing some old office furniture when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the light scurrying of raccoons or the quick movements of stray cats. These were heavy, deliberate steps that made the floorboards creak. They seemed to be coming from the far end of the floor, near the old production area. My first thought was that another explorer had come in, so I called out, "Hello? Anybody there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Complete silence. Then I heard what sounded like deep, heavy breathing. It echoed slightly in the empty space, making it hard to pinpoint the exact location. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm. I've encountered homeless people in abandoned buildings before, and usually they just want to be left alone. But something felt very different this time. The breathing got louder, and I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something large shifting in the shadows about 40 feet away. The shape was massive, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, and definitely not human. It was dark in that section of the building, but I could make out what looked like thick, matted fur. I stood completely frozen, my camera hanging useless at my side. The shape moved again, and this time I heard a low, rumbling sound that made my whole body go cold. It wasn't a growl exactly, more like a deep, threatening hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor. That's when I saw the eyes. Red-brown in color, reflecting the dim light from the broken windows, and far too high up to be any normal animal. They were intelligent eyes, predatory but somehow aware. They were studying me. I'd like to say I did something brave or clever, but honestly, pure instinct took over. I turned and ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. I could hear the heavy footsteps behind me, matching my pace but not quite catching up. The sound echoed through the empty building, along with that terrible breathing that seemed to be getting closer. I practically flew down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. I slipped on the last few steps and slammed hard into the wall, dropping my flashlight. I didn't even think about picking it up. The footsteps were getting louder, and I swear I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I scrambled through the entrance gap, scraping my arm on a piece of metal but barely feeling it. As I ran toward where I'd parked my car, I heard this sound, part roar, part scream, coming from the factory. It was unlike anything I've ever heard before or since, deep and primal, but also somehow human-like. The sound echoed through the trees and seemed to physically push me forward. I made it to my car in record time, fumbling with my keys before finally getting the door open. As I sped away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything following me, just the factory getting smaller in the distance and the dark line of trees behind it. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. The next day, I convinced 2 friends to go back with me. They probably thought I was crazy, but they could tell how shaken up I was. We went in broad daylight, armed with cameras and even a baseball bat, though what good that would have done I don't know. The factory was completely silent. We found my dropped flashlight on the stairs, but otherwise there was nothing unusual. No strange smells, no wet spots, no signs that anything large had been there. We even found the area where I'd seen the shape, but there were no footprints or marks in the thick dust. The only weird thing, and my friends saw this too, was when we were leaving. We were walking back to the car when we all got this intense feeling of being watched. The woods behind the factory seemed darker somehow, deeper. One of my friends swore he saw movement among the trees, but it was too far away to make out clearly. That was 8 months ago. I haven't gone urban exploring since then. I can't bring myself to go into abandoned buildings anymore, especially if they're near wooded areas. I've researched local wildlife extensively, trying to figure out what I might have encountered. I've even gone down some rabbit holes about Bigfoot sightings in Ohio, something I would have laughed at before. There have been reports in that general area, but nothing specifically near that factory. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have assumed they were making it up or had let their imagination run wild, but I know what I experienced. That feeling of being studied by something intelligent, but definitely not human. It changes you. Sometimes when I'm trying to sleep, I can still hear those heavy footsteps and that deep, resonant breathing. I've driven past the factory a few times since then, always in broad daylight and always keeping my distance. The building looks the same as ever, slowly crumbling away. But sometimes, when I glance at the tree line behind it, I swear I can see something moving in the shadows. Something big, something that's watching and waiting. I still have all my urban exploration gear packed away in my closet. Sometimes I think about getting back into it. There are so many interesting abandoned places to document. But then I remember those eyes in the darkness, that prehistoric roar, and I know I'm done with exploring. Some doors are better left closed, some places better left unexplored. Whatever was in that factory that day, it showed me that there are things in this world we're not meant to understand. For those of you who urban explore, especially in Ohio, be careful. If you're in an abandoned building and you smell something like wet dog or hear heavy footsteps when you know you're alone, don't try to be brave. Don't try to get photos. Just get out. Some mysteries aren't worth solving. It was late October 2022, and my friends and I had this brilliant idea to explore some caves in the Monongahela National Forest. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, my roommate Mike, and Mike's cousin Amy, who was visiting from Ohio. We were all in our early 20s, into hiking and outdoor stuff, but none of us were experienced cavers or anything. We just heard about these lesser-known caves from some locals at a diner, and being the adventurous, stupid young people we were, decided to check them out. The morning started normal enough. We packed our gear, headlamps, backup flashlights, water, some snacks, basic first aid kit, you know, the essentials. Jake had downloaded some offline maps of the area since cell service was spotty at best. It was one of those crisp fall mornings, temperature around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and the forest was all red and gold. Perfect day for exploring, or so we thought. The drive to the trailhead took about an hour from our rental cabin, mostly on these narrow mountain roads that kept getting rougher the further we went. We parked Jake's SUV in this small clearing that barely qualified as a parking spot. There wasn't even a proper trail marker, just some old wooden post with faded writing we couldn't make out. The hike to the cave entrance was about 2 miles through pretty dense forest. We kept stopping to check Jake's phone to make sure we were headed the right way. The whole time something felt off. You know that feeling when you're being watched, like the woods are too quiet. That's exactly how it felt. I remember Sarah mentioning how weird it was that we hadn't seen any wildlife, not even birds. At the time, I brushed it off as just the cold weather. We found the cave entrance around 11 a.m. It wasn't very impressive, just this dark opening in the hillside, maybe 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide. There were some old beer cans nearby, so clearly other people had been there, which made us feel a bit better about going in. We did a final gear check, turned on our headlamps, and headed inside. The first 100 feet or so were pretty standard, just your basic cave tunnel sloping gradually downward. The floor was mostly smooth, with some loose rocks here and there. The air got noticeably cooler as we went deeper, and that damp cave smell got stronger. We were talking and joking, our voices echoing off the walls. Mike was telling some stupid ghost story, trying to scare Amy, and we were all laughing. Then the cave opened up into this larger chamber. That's when things started getting weird. The chamber was maybe 30 feet across, with a ceiling so high our headlamps couldn't reach it. There were these strange formations on the walls, not your typical stalactites and stalagmites, but these weird, smooth indentations that looked almost carved. Sarah, who'd taken some geology classes, said she'd never seen anything like them. We were about to explore further when we heard it. At first it was just this low rumble, so deep you felt it more than heard it. We all froze. Mike nervously joked about it being his stomach, but we knew it wasn't. The sound got louder, turning into this deep, rhythmic breathing. It was coming from one of the 3 tunnels leading out of the chamber. Jake whispered for us to turn off our headlamps. In the pitch darkness, the breathing sound became even more pronounced. It definitely wasn't an echo or water dripping or any normal cave noise. It was biological, living, and it was getting closer. Then we heard the scraping, like something large dragging against the cave walls. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever it was could hear it. Amy started whimpering, and Sarah grabbed Jake's arm so tight he later had bruises. I fumbled with my headlamp, turning it back on, and that's when we heard the grunt. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard, not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing natural. It was this deep, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. The beam from my headlamp caught something moving in one of the tunnels, just a shadow, but it was huge, way bigger than a person. That's when we ran. No discussion, no plan, just pure instinct. We scrambled back the way we came, practically tripping over each other. The breathing and scraping sounds followed us, getting louder. Whatever it was moving fast. I don't know how we made it out of that cave. It's all a blur of stumbling, sliding, and pure panic. As we burst out into the daylight, Mike fell face first into this patch of mud near the entrance. When he got up, we all saw them. Footprints. Massive footprints, easily 16 inches long with 5 distinct toes. They weren't there when we went in. We didn't stop to study them. We just ran. But about 100 yards from the cave, Sarah screamed. That's when I saw it. Standing between 2 large trees on the ridge above us was this figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. It wasn't moving, just watching us. The way it stood was so human-like, but so obviously not human at the same time. We sprinted the entire way back to the car. I've never run so fast in my life. The whole time we could hear movement in the forest parallel to us, branches breaking, something big keeping pace with us just out of sight. The sound of its footsteps was like someone dropping bowling balls on the ground. When we finally reached Jake's SUV, our hands were shaking so bad it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As we peeled out of there, Sarah looked back and swears she saw it step onto the road behind us, but Jake was driving so fast I couldn't turn around to look. The drive back was dead silent except for our heavy breathing. None of us knew what to say. What could we say? We'd just encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that had stalked us, hunted us. It wasn't until we were back at the cabin that we really processed what had happened. We spent hours going over every detail, trying to rationalize it. Bear? Too big? Wrong movement? Person in a suit? No way. We were miles from anywhere, and the sounds it made. You can't fake those sounds. We made a pact not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us? But sometimes, late at night, I'll get a text from one of the others. They'll have heard that sound again in a dream, or thought they saw something tall and dark moving through their backyard. I've researched everything I can find about that area since then. Turns out there have been other sightings going back decades. Strange sounds in the woods, massive footprints, glimpses of something that shouldn't exist. The locals know about it. They just don't talk about it with outsiders. I haven't been camping since that day. The others haven't either. Some things you just can't unsee, unhear, unfeel. That feeling of being hunted, of being prey, it changes you. I know what's out there now. I know what's hiding in those caves, in those ancient forests. And I know why some places should be left unexplored. The weirdest part, a week after it happened, Jake went back alone. Yeah, I know, he's crazy. To try to document the footprints. He couldn't find the cave entrance, spent hours searching the exact same area. It was just gone, like it never existed. But we all know what we saw, what we heard, what chased us. Sometimes I think about that thing, standing in its dark cave, waiting. I wonder how many others it's encountered. How many others have escaped, how many haven't. If you're ever hiking in West Virginia and you hear something that sounds like breathing echoing through the trees, or if you feel like something's watching you, run. Just run. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. The 5 of us still get together sometimes, but we never go hiking anymore. We never talk about that day unless we're alone, and even then, only in whispers. But we all know our lives changed in that cave. We all know what's really out there in the dark. I've been holding this story inside for almost 15 years now, and I think it's finally time to share what happened during my last camping trip as a scout. I've only told this to my wife and closest friend, but recent events in Washington state have brought back all these memories, and I feel like I need to get this off my chest. I was 16 at the time, and it was supposed to be just another weekend camping trip with my scout troop in the Olympic National Forest. We'd done dozens of these trips before, nothing special, just basic wilderness survival skills, merit badge work, and the usual scout stuff. There were 12 of us kids and 3 adult leaders, Mr. Thompson, our scoutmaster, Mr. Rodriguez, and Mr. Chen. We arrived at the campsite Friday afternoon in early October. The weather was typical for Washington, overcast, slightly chilly, with that constant feeling that rain could start any minute. The site was pretty remote, about a 2-hour drive from Seattle, and then another 45-minute hike from where we parked the vans. We were deep in the forest, surrounded by massive Douglas firs and western red cedars. Some of these trees were absolutely ancient. You couldn't even wrap your arms halfway around them. Setting up camp was routine. We split into 3 groups of 4 scouts per tent, plus the leaders in their own tent. My tent mates were Kevin, Marcus, and Dylan, guys I'd been camping with for years. We got everything set up before dark, had dinner, standard camping fare, hot dogs and beans, and sat around the campfire telling stupid jokes and stories. Looking back, the first weird thing happened during dinner, but none of us thought much of it at the time. We kept hearing these odd cracking sounds from the woods, like branches breaking, but not the normal way they break when deer or other animals step on them. These were louder, and they seemed to be coming from higher up, like something was breaking branches well above ground level. Mr. Thompson mentioned it might be wind damage, but it wasn't particularly windy that evening. We all turned in around 10 p.m. I remember checking my watch because Marcus was complaining about it being too early to sleep, but we had an early start planned for Saturday's activities. I dozed off pretty quickly, warm in my sleeping bag despite the dropping temperature outside. The real nightmare started around 2:30 a.m. I know the exact time because the sound that woke me up made me immediately check my watch. Something had hit our tent, not like a branch falling, but like someone had thrown a rock at it. Before I could even sit up, another one hit, and then another. These weren't pebbles. They were decent-sized rocks, maybe baseball-sized or larger, and they were hitting all 4 tents in our campsite. Kevin was already awake, and Marcus and Dylan woke up from the impacts. We could hear shouting from the other tents. Everyone was awake now. Mr. Thompson called out for everyone to stay in their tents, which was probably the scariest part, because his voice had this edge to it I'd never heard before. He wasn't just being cautious, he was frightened. The rock throwing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 5 minutes. Then everything went quiet. Not normal forest quiet, this was different. No insects chirping, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that made it hard to breathe. That's when we heard it, this deep, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but definitely wasn't human. It seemed to come from different directions, like whatever was making it was moving around our campsite. The sound was so low it made my chest vibrate. Dylan started hyperventilating, and Marcus was trying to keep him quiet while Kevin and I just sat there frozen. We stayed like that for at least an hour, nobody daring to move or speak above a whisper. The sounds continued intermittently, that weird, rumbling, heavy footsteps that seemed to circle our campsite, and occasional crashes in the underbrush that sounded like something massive moving through the forest. Around 4 a.m., things finally quieted down. Mr. Thompson called out again, asking if everyone was okay. We all responded, and he told us to stay in our tents until sunrise. None of us slept. We just sat there, listening to every tiny sound, jumping at every snapping twig. When the sun finally came up around 6:30 a.m., Mr. Thompson gave us the all-clear to come out. What we found around our campsite still gives me nightmares. There were rocks scattered everywhere, not small ones but chunks of stone that would have taken considerable strength to throw. But that wasn't the worst part. The ground around our campsite was torn up with footprints, massive footprints. I'm not talking about bear prints or anything normal. These were clearly bipedal, roughly human-shaped but enormous, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. They were deeply pressed into the soil, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The prints formed a clear circle around our campsite, showing that something had been walking around us all night. While we were examining the prints, Tommy, one of the younger scouts, started crying. He said he'd woken up during the night and looked out through a small gap in his tent. He described seeing a huge, dark figure moving between the trees. He estimated it was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, and moved in a way that was almost human but not quite. Nobody doubted him. We'd all heard it, and the evidence was right there in front of us. But the most disturbing discovery came when Mr. Rodriguez pointed out the trees around our campsite. Several of them had deep scratch marks running up their trunks, starting at about 8 feet off the ground and going up another 3, 4 feet. The bark was deeply gouged, and some of the marks looked fresh, with sap still oozing out. These weren't bear marks. They were too high, too organized, almost like territory markers. Mr. Thompson quickly organized us to break camp. Nobody argued or complained about missing breakfast or the activities we'd planned. We just wanted to get out of there. As we were packing up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of our food containers, a heavy-duty plastic box that we'd secured in a tree about 12 feet up, standard procedure for bear protection, was simply gone. Not knocked down, not broken open, just gone. We found it about 50 yards into the forest, completely crushed, with tooth marks puncturing the thick plastic. The hike back to the vans was tense. We stayed in a tight group, nobody wandering off or falling behind. Every sound made us jump, and we kept looking over our shoulders. About halfway back, we all heard a loud crash in the forest to our right, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps moving parallel to our group. Mr. Thompson and Mr. Rodriguez positioned themselves on that side of the group, while Mr. Chen took the lead. We practically jogged the rest of the way out. When we reached the vans, Mr. Thompson had a serious talk with all of us. He said that while he couldn't explain what had happened, it would be best if we didn't discuss it outside our group. He was worried about the troops' reputation and the possibility of losing access to camping sites if rumors spread. We all agreed, mostly because we weren't sure anyone would believe us anyway. The drive home was silent. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what we'd experienced. When my parents asked about the trip, I just said it was too rainy and we came back early. I think they knew something was wrong. I had trouble sleeping for weeks afterward, but I stuck to the story. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Could it have been an elaborate prank? Maybe, but those footprints and claw marks were real, and no human could have made them. A bear? The bipedal prints and the height of those scratch marks rule that out. Whatever was in those woods that night was something else entirely. I've done a lot of research since then, reading about similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Some details match up eerily well with what we experienced. The rock throwing, the deep vocalizations, the footprints. But I've never found a satisfactory explanation for what we encountered. I still go camping occasionally, but never in that part of Washington, and never without feeling a deep unease when the sun goes down. Sometimes when I'm lying in my tent at night, I catch myself listening for that distinctive rumbling sound or the heavy footsteps circling in the darkness. The strangest part? A few years ago, I ran into Kevin at a wedding, and after a few drinks, we finally talked about that night. He told me something he'd never shared before. When we were packing up camp that morning, he'd found something caught on a branch near our tent, a patch of coarse, dark hair unlike anything he'd ever seen. He'd kept it for years, but eventually threw it away, because looking at it brought back too many memories of that night. I don't know what was out there in the Olympic National Forest that night. Part of me doesn't want to know, but I do know that 12 teenagers and 3 grown men don't imagine the same thing at the same time, and we certainly didn't imagine those footprints, scratch marks, and that crushed container. Sometimes, when I see news reports about strange sightings in the Washington forests, I think about coming forward with our story. But then I remember Mr. Thompson's words about keeping it quiet, and I wonder if maybe some things are better left untold. Still, with all the recent sightings in that area, I felt like I needed to share this. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and has been afraid to speak up. All I know is that there are things in those woods that defy explanation, and that night changed how I view the wilderness forever. I've been hunting for over 25 years now, and what happened last winter in the Turtle Mountains of North Dakota still keeps me up at night. I'm not the type to spook easily. I've had my fair share of close calls with bears, wolves, and mountain lions, but this was different. I'm writing this down because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. It was January 15th, around 5:30 a.m. when I left my truck at an old logging trail head. The temperature was hovering around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 15 degrees Celsius, and there was about 2 feet of snow on the ground. I'd been tracking a particularly large buck in this area for the past few weeks, and the fresh snowfall from the night before meant perfect tracking conditions. I was well prepared for the weather: thermal underwear, heavy wool pants, my trusted Carhartt jacket, and my grandfather's old Russian fur hat. I had my Winchester .30, 06 with me, along with my usual day pack containing water, jerky, a first aid kit, and other essentials. I'd hunted this area dozens of times before, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. The first couple hours were uneventful. The forest was dead quiet, the way it gets when it's really cold, that kind of silence that seems to swallow every sound. I found some fresh deer tracks around 7:30 a.m. and started following them. That's when things started getting weird. I was moving slowly, checking the wind direction every few minutes, when I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Next to the deer prints I'd been following, there was another set of tracks. At first I thought maybe a bear, but these were different. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was massive, probably around 4-5 feet. I've seen plenty of bear tracks in my life, and these weren't bear tracks. Bears have a distinct pad pattern, and their back paw usually steps into the front paw print. These were clearly bipedal tracks. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, but I was about 6 miles deep into some pretty rough terrain. Who would go through the effort of hauling fake feet all the way out here just to make some tracks? Plus, the way the snow was compressed and the clear toe impressions, these looked real. I took some photos with my phone, which I later lost along with my pack, and decided to follow the tracks parallel to my deer trail. That's when I started getting this feeling. You know that sensation when you just know you're being watched? It was like that, but 10 times stronger. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and every few minutes I'd hear branches cracking in the distance. Around 11 a.m., I heard something that I'll never forget. It started as a low, rumbling sound, almost like distant thunder, but then it changed into this deep, guttural vocalization that I can't even properly describe. It wasn't a bear's roar or a mountain lion's scream. It was lower, more powerful, and seemed to come from something with a much larger chest cavity. The sound echoed through the trees and seemed to come from multiple directions. I've never heard anything like it before or since. I immediately chambered around and did a slow 360-degree scan of my surroundings. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that heavy, watching presence. I decided to head back to my truck, but I wanted to check out one more ridge first, thinking maybe I could spot whatever was making those sounds. That was a mistake. As I crested the ridge, I came across a scene that made my blood run cold. There was a clearing where several trees had been snapped. Not cut, not fallen naturally, but snapped like twigs. These were mature aspens, at least 8 inches in diameter. They were broken at around 8-9 feet high, with some of the tops twisted and intertwined with each other. It looked like something had made some kind of primitive structure, but the strength required to do this would have been immense. I found fresh scat nearby that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Massive piles full of partially digested berries and what looked like deer bone fragments. The prints were everywhere in this area, and some of the trees had bark stripped off at heights that would have required something at least 8 feet tall to reach. That's when I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps in the snow behind me, accompanied by deep, rhythmic breathing. It was close, maybe 50 yards away, but the thick brush blocked my view. Whatever it was big, and it was moving parallel to me. I could hear branches snapping under its weight. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle. I've been in some scary situations before. I once had to stare down an angry moose at 20 yards, but this was different. This felt intelligent, calculated, like it was herding me. I started walking faster toward where I thought my truck was, trying to keep my cool. The footsteps kept pace with me, sometimes getting closer, sometimes falling back. Every time I'd stop, it would stop. When I'd change direction, it would adjust its path to stay parallel to me. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. Then I made another mistake. I started running. I know, you're never supposed to run in the wilderness. But rational thinking was long gone by this point. I just wanted to get out of there. As soon as I started running, I heard this massive crash through the underbrush behind me, like something very large was now charging through the forest. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls was getting closer. I dropped my pack somewhere along the way. I didn't even realize it until later. I just ran, gasping in the cold air, my lungs burning. I jumped over fallen logs and crashed through brush, all while this thing was gaining on me. The sounds it was making, God, those sounds. Like a mix between heavy breathing and those deep vocalizations from before, but closer, much closer. I broke through some thick brush and found myself at the edge of a small clearing. That's when I saw it. Just for a split second, through the trees on the other side of the clearing, a massive dark figure moving between the trunks. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with broad shoulders and long arms. The way it moved, it was so fluid, so fast for its size. Not like a person in a suit, not like any animal I've ever seen. I turned and ran in a different direction, no longer caring where I was going. I just needed to get away from that thing. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, then walked, then ran again. Somehow, by sheer luck or divine intervention, I stumbled onto the logging road about a mile from my truck. I've never moved so fast in my life. When I finally got to my truck, my hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I was pulling out, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, something large and dark moving at the edge of the tree line. I floored it and didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I never recovered my pack or my phone. I went back a week later with 2 buddies to look for it, but we couldn't find the exact location. The whole area felt different somehow, and we didn't stay long. The tracks would have been gone by then anyway, with the new snow we'd gotten. That was last winter, and I haven't been back to that part of the forest since. I still hunt, but I stay closer to town now, and never alone. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was the cold playing tricks on my mind. Maybe it was just some weird combination of natural phenomena. But deep down, I know what I saw. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does. I've heard all the stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch over the years, always dismissed them as tall tales and campfire stories. Now, I'm not so sure. Whatever I encountered that day was real, it was intelligent, and it was definitely not human. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I experienced, and I know there are things in this world we don't understand. These days, when I hear about other hunters having strange experiences in remote areas, I don't laugh anymore. I just listen. And when they describe that feeling of being watched, those weird sounds, or those impossibly large tracks in the snow, I know exactly what they're talking about. Because whatever's out there in those woods, it's real, and it's watching. I'm a long-haul trucker, and I've been driving the Nevada routes for over 6 years. I've seen some weird stuff on those desert highways at night, but nothing like what happened to me on Route 375 back in September. It was around 2 a.m., and I was making my usual run from Vegas to Ely. The road was completely empty, which isn't unusual for that time of night, especially on that stretch. I had my radio playing softly, just trying to stay alert. The moon was almost full, so visibility was actually pretty decent for nighttime. You could see the desert stretching out on both sides, all silver-gray under the moonlight. I remember checking my fuel gauge and thinking I should probably stop at the next rest area, even though I usually avoid those places at night. That's when I first noticed something odd in my peripheral vision, maybe about 200 yards ahead. At first I thought it was just a shadow from one of the Joshua trees, but as I got closer I realized it was moving. I slowed down from about 65 to maybe 40 miles per hour, and that's when I saw it clearly in my headlights. This massive dark figure stepping onto the road from the right shoulder. The thing that struck me first was how fluid its movement was. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like a bear. It moved like an athlete, but it was huge. I'd guess at least 8 feet tall, and it was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, but somehow I managed to slow down even more. The figure turned its head toward my truck, and I swear to God, its eyes reflected my headlights like a deer's would, but they were much higher off the ground. In the 3 seconds or so that I could see it clearly, I noticed its arms were incredibly long, hanging almost to its knees. Then, in one smooth motion, it crossed the entire 2-lane highway in about 2 strides and disappeared into the darkness on the other side. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process what I'd just seen. I'm not some teenager who scares easily. I'm a 42-year-old man who's been driving trucks for almost 2 decades. But in that moment, I felt like a kid. I pulled over, keeping my engine running and lights on. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, one of those heavy mag lights that could double as a weapon if needed. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. After about 5 minutes of sitting there, telling myself I was being ridiculous, I finally worked up the courage to step out. The desert air was cold, and everything was dead quiet except for the idle of my engine. I walked to where I thought I'd seen the figure cross, sweeping my flashlight beam across the ground. That's when I found them, footprints in the sandy soil on both sides of the road. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I took out my phone to take pictures, but my hands were shaking so badly that most came out blurry. I did manage to get one decent shot of a print, though it doesn't really convey the scale properly. The next day, when I showed it to my buddy Mike at the truck stop in Ely, he just laughed and said it was probably just a bear print distorted by the wind. But I know what bear prints look like. These were different. They were too long, too narrow, and the toe placement was all wrong. Plus, I've never seen a bear move the way this thing moved. I got back in my truck and decided to push on to the next rest area, about 30 miles ahead. By the time I pulled in, my nerves had settled a bit, and I was starting to second-guess myself. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe the moonlight and shadows had played tricks on my eyes. I backed into a spot at the far end of the rest area, away from the only other vehicle there, an old RV with Ohio plates. I figured I'd try to get a couple hours of sleep before finishing my run. I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. You know that sensation when you just know something's staring at you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. I opened my eyes and looked in my mirrors, but all I could see was darkness beyond the reach of the rest area's lights. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, crunching on the gravel behind my trailer. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as the footsteps slowly moved along the side of my truck. They were spaced far apart, like whatever was making them had a really long stride. When they reached the front of my truck, they stopped. I was terrified to look out my windows, but I forced myself to. There was nothing there that I could see, but I could feel it. The presence was overwhelming. Then came the smell, this powerful, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it seemed to seep through my closed windows. My truck actually rocked slightly, like something had just barely touched it. That was it for me. I started my engine, threw it in gear, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight through until sunrise, my eyes glued to my mirrors the whole time. I didn't see anything following me, but that feeling of being watched didn't go away until the sun came up. I called my supervisor the next day and requested a different route, told him I was having some family issues and needed to stay closer to Vegas. He didn't ask too many questions, thankfully. I haven't been back on that stretch of 375 since then, and I don't plan to. I've heard other drivers talk about strange things they've seen out there, but most of them treat it like a joke. The thing is, I know what I saw. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and while I wish I could convince myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the light, I know it wasn't. Whatever that thing was, it was real, and it was intelligent. The way it moved, the way it seemed to deliberately follow me to that rest area. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. I still have that blurry photo of the footprint on my phone, but I don't show it to people anymore. I'm tired of the skeptical looks and the jokes about drinking on the job. Sometimes I think about reporting it to one of those cryptozoology websites, but what's the point? They'd probably just think I'm making it up for attention. All I know is that there's something out there in the Nevada desert that shouldn't exist, but it does. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving my new route, I catch myself scanning the roadside, half expecting to see those reflective eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I keep telling myself I'm being paranoid, but I've started keeping my maglite within arm's reach, and I never, ever stop at rest areas after midnight anymore. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to write this down, to get it out of my system. Maybe someone else out there has seen something similar and is afraid to talk about it. All I can say is, if you're driving through Nevada late at night, especially on Route 375, keep your eyes open and don't stop unless you absolutely have to. And if you see something tall and dark step out onto the road ahead of you, don't stop to investigate. Just keep driving. I've been a runner for over 8 years now, and night running has always been my thing. Between my job at the software company and taking care of my kids, evenings are really the only time I can squeeze in my training. There's something peaceful about running at night, less traffic, cooler temperatures, and that satisfying silence that helps clear your head after a long day. My usual route takes me along the edge of the Marshall Creek Forest Reserve, about 2 miles from my house. It's a well-maintained trail that I've probably run hundreds of times. The first mile is through a residential area, then the trail curves alongside the reserve for about 3 miles before looping back. I always loved that stretch, the way the trees would rustle in the breeze, how the moonlight would filter through the branches. Well, at least I used to love it. Everything changed about 2 months ago. It started subtly at first. I'd get this weird feeling during my runs, like someone was watching me. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? Yeah, that. I kept brushing it off. I mean, I'm not usually the paranoid type, and I've done this route so many times I could probably run it blindfolded. Then came that night, October 12th. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and I'd gotten home late from her party, so I went for my run later than usual, around 10 p.m. The moon was almost full, but there were patches of clouds moving across it, creating these shifting shadows on the trail. The temperature had dropped to about 45 degrees, perfect running weather. I was about 2 miles into my run, right where the trail runs closest to the forest reserve. I had my usual gear, reflective vest, headlamp, my trusted Nike running shoes, and my phone playing music through one earbud. I always keep one ear free to stay aware of my surroundings. The trail there is about 8 feet wide, with dense forest on one side and a more open area on the other. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just my footsteps echoing off the trees, but something felt off about the rhythm. The steps were heavier, deeper somehow. They seemed to be coming from about 30 feet behind me. I remember thinking it was probably another runner, but when I slowed down, the steps didn't get any closer. They just matched my pace perfectly. I stopped completely, pulling out my earbud to listen better. The footsteps continued for about 2 more seconds after I stopped. Then, dead silence. Just the sound of my breathing and crickets chirping. I turned around, shining my headlamp down the trail, but there was nothing there. Absolutely nothing. No other runners, no animals, nothing moving in the bushes. But that smell, God, that smell. It hit me like a wall. This incredibly strong, sour odor, like a mix between rotting meat and wet dog, but worse. Much worse. It was so intense it made my eyes water. I've smelled dead animals in the woods before, but this was different. This smell seemed fresh, active, present. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay still and listen. That's when I heard the breathing. Not my own. This was deeper, raspier, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond my headlamp's beam. I didn't stick around to investigate. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The whole time, I could hear those footsteps behind me, keeping pace. They weren't running steps. They were too heavy, too spaced out for that. Whatever it was taking these massive strides to keep up with my sprint. I didn't stop until I reached the residential area. The footsteps faded away about halfway there, but I didn't slow down until I could see house lights. When I finally stopped, I was drenched in sweat and my legs were shaking. That smell had followed me for a while but was gone now. The next morning, I convinced myself I needed to go back and look. I know, stupid decision, but I had to know if I was just imagining things. I drove to the trail just after sunrise. What I found made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft dirt of the trail, but these weren't human footprints. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was impossible, at least 6 feet apart. And they weren't shoe prints. They showed what looked like toes, but massive ones. They were pressed about an inch deep into the packed dirt of the trail, which meant whatever made them had to be incredibly heavy. I took pictures with my phone, but they came out blurry and didn't really show the scale properly. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've spent weeks trying to rationalize it. When I told my running buddies, they laughed it off, said I was probably spooked by a deer or a bear, even though we haven't had bears in this area for decades. My wife suggested I was just stressed from work and imagined it. But I know what I experienced. That smell, those footsteps, they were real. I've started running at the high school track instead. Sometimes I drive past the trail entrance on my way to work, and I get this urge to go back, to prove to myself that it really happened. But then I remember that sound, those deep, heavy footsteps matching my pace in the darkness, and I keep driving. The weirdest part? I checked local news and social media, thinking surely someone else must have experienced something similar. Nothing, just the occasional post about coyote sightings or lost pets. It's like whatever was out there that night was there specifically for me, and then just vanished. I still run, but never alone and never at night anymore. I've installed a treadmill in my garage for evening workouts. My running buddies think I'm being ridiculous, but they weren't there. They didn't hear those footsteps or smell that horrific odor. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can still hear those heavy footfalls, perfectly matching the rhythm of my running pace, getting neither closer nor farther away, just following. The trail is still there, still popular with daytime runners and cyclists. Life goes on as normal. But I know something's out there in those woods, something that was interested enough to follow me but held back from doing whatever it was planning to do. And sometimes, on cloudy nights when the moon is full, I wonder if it's still waiting there, hoping I'll come back for one more run. My wife Sarah and I are avid mountain bikers. We've been riding trails across Colorado for the past 6 years and thought we'd seen it all. But what happened to us last August on the Bear Creek Trail near Telluride completely changed our perspective on what's out there in the wilderness. We'd heard about this lesser-known trail from a local bike shop owner. He mentioned it was challenging but rewarding, with incredible views and barely any traffic. That should have been our first red flag. Why would such a beautiful trail be so empty? But we were excited about exploring somewhere new, away from the usual tourist crowds. We got a late start that day because our car had some issues on the drive up. It was already 2 p.m. when we finally started riding. The trail began innocently enough, typical Colorado single track winding through dense pine forest. The air was crisp and everything felt peaceful. We planned to ride for about 3-4 hours and head back before sunset. Around mile 7, things started feeling different. The forest got quieter. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but an unnatural silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was exactly like that, but amplified by 1,000. Sarah felt it too. I could tell by how she kept looking over her shoulder. We started hearing these weird sounds, not like any animal I've heard before, and I've encountered plenty of wildlife on our rides. It was like something large was moving parallel to us through the trees, but staying just out of sight. The sound would stop when we stopped, and start again when we started riding. Whatever it was intelligent enough to mirror our movements. By this point, it was getting close to dusk, and the forest was getting darker. We decided to take a quick break to eat some energy bars and check our GPS. That's when we saw it. About 50 yards away, between 2 massive pines, there was this huge, dark shape. When I say huge, I mean huge. It must have been at least 8 feet tall. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that straight or move that way. The shape moved with this weird fluid motion, like it was trying to stay hidden but was too big to do so effectively. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. We both froze, barely breathing. The thing stopped moving too, as if it knew we'd spotted it. For what felt like forever, we just stood there in this terrifying standoff. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. It was deep, like it came from something with a massive chest cavity. That's when Sarah whispered, "We need to go, now." But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by this shape in the shadows that seemed to be studying us just as intently as we were studying it. Finally it moved again, disappearing behind a cluster of trees. That broke our paralysis. We quickly grabbed our bikes, but instead of heading back immediately, my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what we'd just seen. Sarah thought I was crazy, but she wouldn't let me go alone, so we cautiously walked our bikes toward where the figure had been. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and pine needles, but in a patch of softer soil we found them. Footprints. Not animal tracks, not bear prints, but actual footprints that looked disturbingly human-like, except they were enormous. I wear a size 11 shoe, and these prints were easily twice that size. They were deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We tried to follow the tracks, but they disappeared when the ground got rockier. By now, the sun was setting fast, and the forest was getting seriously dark. The sounds around us were getting louder and closer, branches breaking, heavy footsteps, that same deep grunting noise. It seemed like there was more than one source now, like we were being surrounded. That's when true panic set in. We jumped on our bikes and started riding back as fast as we could in the fading light. I've never ridden that fast on a technical trail before, and honestly, it's a miracle we didn't crash. The whole time, we could hear movement in the forest keeping pace with us. These things, whatever they were, could move as fast as we could ride. The sounds followed us for at least 2 miles before gradually fading away. We didn't stop or slow down until we reached our car. When we finally got there, we were both shaking so bad we could barely load the bikes onto the rack. The drive home was completely silent. We were both too shocked to talk about what had happened. It's been months now, and we still haven't been back to that trail. We've only been on heavily trafficked trails since then, and never close to sunset. Sarah doesn't like talking about it, but I know she thinks about it as much as I do. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in that area, and let's just say we're not the only ones who've experienced something like this. I know how this sounds. Before this happened, I would have laughed at anyone telling me this story. I was the biggest skeptic when it came to Bigfoot or Sasquatch stories, but now, I'm not so sure anymore. Whatever we encountered that day was real, it was intelligent, and it was definitely not human or any known animal. The weirdest part? Last week I was cleaning our gear in the garage and found something stuck to the frame of my bike. A long, coarse hair, about 6 inches long, dark brown with a reddish tint. I've got it stored in a Ziploc bag, but I'm honestly not sure what to do with it. Part of me wants to get it tested, but another part of me is afraid of what I might find out. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those sounds in my dreams, that deep, guttural grunt, and the heavy footsteps moving through the forest. Sarah and I are planning to move to a different state next year. We tell everyone it's for work, but honestly, we just don't feel comfortable in these mountains anymore. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some experiences change you forever. I don't know exactly what we encountered that day, but I know one thing for certain. We were never meant to see it. What happened last October in the winter mountains of Utah still keeps me up at night sometimes. I've always been skeptical about cryptids and all that stuff, but after what my friends and I experienced that weekend, I honestly don't know what to believe anymore. It was supposed to be just another hunting weekend. My buddy Mike has this family cabin near Mirror Lake, about 3 hours from Salt Lake City. We'd been there dozens of times before. Me, Mike, his cousin Pete, and our friend Dave. The cabin isn't anything fancy, just this old 2-bedroom place his grandpa built in the 70s, but it's always been our go-to spot for fall hunting trips. We drove up there on Friday afternoon, October 13th, Yeah, I know. Should have been our first warning. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, leaves starting to turn. We got there around 4 p.m., enough time to unpack and get settled before dark. The cabin sits in this small clearing, surrounded by thick aspens and pines. There's no electricity, just a generator we use sparingly, and our phones barely get any signal up there. Everything was normal at first. We got the generator running, stocked the kitchen, and spent the evening playing cards and having a few beers. Mike was telling us about this elk he'd spotted last time he was up here with his dad. It was getting cold outside, so we had the wood stove going. Just a typical night at the cabin. Around 11 p.m., Dave went outside to take a leak. The cabin has a bathroom, but the plumbing was acting up. He came back in looking weird, like he'd seen something. "Guys, did you hear that?" he asked. We hadn't heard anything over our conversation and the cards shuffling. "There's something moving out there. Something big." We kind of laughed it off at first. There's always wildlife around. Elk, deer, maybe the occasional moose or bear. But Dave kept insisting this was different. He said he heard heavy footsteps and breathing that didn't sound like any animal he knew, and he's been hunting these mountains since he was a kid. We decided to check it out, grabbing our flashlights. The moon was almost full, but the trees cast these deep shadows everywhere. We stood on the porch, sweeping our lights across the clearing. Everything looked normal at first, just the usual nighttime forest sounds. But then we heard it too. Crack. Something big stepped on a branch maybe 50 yards out, in the tree line to the north of the cabin, then another step, and another. Whatever it was heavy. You could feel the impact through the ground. Mike pointed his light in that direction, but all we could see were trees and shadows. Then came the smell. I've been around plenty of wild animals, but this was different. It was this overwhelming, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I can't even describe. Pete started gagging. It was that bad. That's when we heard the sound that still haunts my dreams. This deep, guttural growl that turned into something like a roar, but not quite. It wasn't a bear. I've heard plenty of bear sounds, and this was nothing like that. It was deeper, more human-like, but not human at all. It echoed through the trees, and I swear I felt it in my chest. We all ran back inside, slamming the door and locking it. Dave was shaking so bad he could barely hold his beer. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us. But deep down, we all knew this was something else. The rest of the night was hell. Whatever was out there kept circling the cabin. We could hear its footsteps in the leaves, branches snapping under its weight. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting near the window when I saw it, just for a second, but I'll never forget it. This massive dark shape moved past the window. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, but the silhouette was unmistakably upright, walking on 2 legs. None of the others saw it directly, and honestly, I was glad. They were already freaked out enough by the sounds and the smell. We stayed up all night, huddled in the main room, our rifles loaded, not that any of us really thought they'd do much good. The generator ran out of gas around 3 a.m., and none of us dared to go outside to refill it. The sounds continued until just before dawn. We heard more of those horrible roars, and twice something hit the side of the cabin, not like it was trying to break in, more like it was testing the walls. The whole structure shook each time. When the sun finally came up, we waited another hour before venturing outside. What we found made my blood run cold. The entire clearing around the cabin was full of footprints, huge, human-like prints that must have been 16 inches long at least. Some were so deep in the soil you could fit your whole hand in the impression. Whatever made them had to weigh hundreds of pounds. But that wasn't the worst part. On the north side of the cabin, about 7 feet up, there were these long scratches in the wood. 4 parallel marks, like something had dragged its fingers or claws across the wall. The marks were deep, cutting almost half an inch into the solid wood. We found broken branches all around the clearing, some as thick as my arm, snapped like twigs. And there was this weird pattern to how they were broken, not like something had just blindly crashed through, but like whatever did it was methodically testing its strength. Dave took photos of everything on his phone, but when we checked them later, Most came out too blurry or dark to make out details. The footprints showed up okay, but without anything for scale in the photos, they don't really convey how massive they were. We didn't stick around to investigate further. We packed up our stuff in record time and got out of there. The drive back was mostly silent. What could we even say? We all saw and heard things that shouldn't exist, things that don't fit into our understanding of what's possible. We made a pact not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? But lately, I've been doing research, reading other people's encounters in these mountains. There are so many similar stories. The footprints, the sounds, the smell. Too many to be coincidence. Mike hasn't been back to the cabin since then. Says he's trying to sell it. But who's going to buy a remote cabin with those marks still on the wall? Pete and Dave won't even talk about that night anymore. But I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I close my eyes, I see that massive shadow moving past the window. Every time I'm in the woods, I find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if something's watching me. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had too much to drink. But I know what we experienced that night. Whatever's out there in those mountains, it's real, it's intelligent, and it's nothing like anything science has documented. The weirdest part? Sometimes I get this feeling it wasn't trying to hurt us. It could have easily broken into the cabin if it wanted to. Those scratches on the wall proved it had the strength. It was almost like it was curious, studying us. I don't know which is more terrifying, the thought that it was hostile, or the idea that something that powerful was just playing with us like a kid with a new toy. I haven't told anyone else about this until now. My wife knows something happened that weekend. I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes. But I haven't given her the details. How do you tell someone you love that everything they think they know about the world might be wrong? I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just putting this out there because I need someone else to know what happened. Those mountains hold secrets, and after what we experienced, I'm content letting them stay secret. Some questions are better left unanswered. If you're planning a trip to the winters, especially around Mirror Lake, just be careful. And if you hear something big moving through the trees at night, if you catch that distinctive smell, or if you hear that sound, that horrible, impossible sound, don't try to investigate. Get somewhere safe and wait for dawn. Sometimes I think we were lucky it was just curious that night. I don't want to know what happens when one of these things gets angry. And I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened to me that day in the Arizona desert, but I still can't explain it. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. This happened in June 2019 at Redacted National Park. I'm deliberately not naming the exact location because I don't want anyone trying to find this place. I was on a solo road trip through Arizona, something I'd been planning for months. I'm an experienced hiker and have done plenty of solo trips before, so being alone in remote areas never bothered me. Well, until that day. It was early morning, around 6:30 a.m., when I pulled into the park's entrance. The temperature was already climbing past 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and I knew it would get much hotter later. I had all my gear, 3 liters of water, trail mix, beef jerky, first aid kit, GPS device, and my phone, though I knew service would be spotty at best. I'd researched this particular canyon trail the night before. It wasn't on any tourist maps, but I'd found it mentioned in some hiking forums. People said it had amazing rock formations and was usually empty because most tourists stuck to the main trails. The ranger at the entrance station looked surprised when I mentioned where I was heading. She warned me that the trail wasn't maintained and suggested I stick to the marked paths instead. But I was stubborn and assured her I knew what I was doing. She made me sign an additional waiver and reminded me to be back before sunset. Looking back, I should have listened to her. The drive to the trailhead took about 40 minutes on increasingly rough roads. By the time I parked, mine was the only car in sight. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just that heavy desert stillness that feels like it could swallow you whole. The canyon entrance was about a quarter-mile walk from where I parked. The first hour was actually beautiful. The canyon walls rose gradually on either side, creating these amazing shadows, as the morning sun moved higher. The rock formations were incredible. Layers of red and orange sandstone twisted into shapes that looked almost man-made. I took lots of photos and stopped frequently to drink water and check my GPS. It was around 8:45 a.m. when things started feeling different. The canyon had narrowed considerably, and the walls were now towering at least 200 feet above me. The temperature had dropped noticeably, which was welcome, but something felt off. You know that feeling when you're alone in your house but suddenly feel like someone's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. I first heard the sound while I was taking a brief rest. It was faint, just the slight scraping of rock on rock, like someone carefully moving stones. I assumed it was just natural settling or temperature changes causing the rocks to shift. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like heavy breathing. My first thought was mountain lion, but this breathing was different. Deeper, more rhythmic, almost human-like, but too loud. I stood completely still, straining to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from somewhere above me on the canyon wall, but when I looked up, I couldn't see anything unusual. I should have turned back right then, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I'd come this far, and according to my GPS, there was a particularly spectacular rock formation just another half-mile ahead. So I kept going, though I picked up my pace. The breathing sounds continued intermittently. Sometimes they seemed to come from behind me, sometimes from ahead. I started taking photos more frequently, telling myself it was for documentation, but really hoping to catch something in the background that might explain what I was hearing. About 15 minutes later, I came to a point where the canyon widened slightly, and there was a large cave opening about 30 feet up the wall. That's when the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. I can't explain it rationally, but I knew something was in that cave, observing me. The air felt heavier, and the breathing sound was unmistakable now, a deep, raspy inhale followed by a long exhale that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. I raised my camera to take a picture of the cave, and just as I pressed the button, I saw movement in the darkness. Something shifted back, further into the cave. The photo just shows the empty cave mouth, but I know what I saw. It was big, much bigger than a person, and it moved with purpose. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my camera. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to walk calmly and steadily. Running in panic through a canyon is a good way to get injured or lost. But after about 50 yards I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving along the canyon rim above me. Whatever it was keeping pace with me. I could hear rocks occasionally tumbling down the canyon walls, and that breathing... God, that breathing. It was louder now and had a different quality to it, almost excited or agitated. I walked faster, constantly checking behind me and above. The sun was higher now, and the shadows in the canyon were shorter, which somehow made everything more terrifying. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to take shelter. I was exposed, and whatever was up there knew it. Then I saw the prints. At first I almost missed them, just some odd depressions in the sandy soil. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. They were footprints, but not human. Each one was at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions. They weren't fresh, maybe a day or two old, but they were clear enough to see details, and they were going in both directions, as if something had been pacing this section of the canyon. I took out my phone to photograph the prints, but my hands were shaking so badly the pictures came out blurry. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. From somewhere above came a low, rumbling sound that was unlike anything I've ever heard. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a moan. It was somewhere in between, and it had an almost human quality to it that made it so much worse. That's when I broke and started running. I know it was stupid, but fear took over. I could hear movement above keeping pace with me, faster now. Rocks and pebbles rained down from above. The breathing was louder, more aggressive. At one point something large crashed behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I ran until my lungs were burning. The canyon walls all looked the same, and for one terrifying moment I thought I'd gotten turned around. But then I recognized a distinctive red rock formation I'd photographed earlier, and I knew I was going the right way. The sounds above me continued, but they seemed more distant now. Still, I didn't slow down until I could see my car. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, snatched them up with trembling hands, and practically dove into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I finally looked back at the canyon entrance. Nothing was there, just the silent, imposing rock walls baking in the late morning sun. But as I put the car in gear, I swear I saw movement, just a shadow really, passing between two rocks near the canyon mouth. Something large, moving with an unnaturally smooth gait. I drove way too fast on that dirt road, not caring about what it was doing to my suspension. I didn't stop until I reached the main park entrance. The same ranger was there, and she must have seen something in my face because she asked if I was okay. I just nodded and drove on. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters in that area. I found a few vague references to strange sounds and unexplained footprints, but nothing conclusive. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in Arizona, but most of those are in the forested northern parts of the state, not in the desert canyons. The rational part of my brain tries to explain it away. Mountain lion, bears, though they're rare in that area, my imagination running wild in the desert solitude. But I know what I heard, what I felt, what I saw. Those footprints were real. That breathing was real. That feeling of being hunted was real. I still hike and camp, but never alone anymore, and never in narrow canyons. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear that breathing, that not quite human sound echoing off canyon walls. I don't know what was following me that day, but I know it was real, and I know it was intelligent. It wasn't just tracking me, it was studying me, assessing me. And sometimes I wonder, what would have happened if I'd gone just a little further into that canyon, or if I'd arrived just a little later in the day? I've attached one of the less blurry photos of the footprints and the cave opening. The quality isn't great because my hands were shaking so badly, but maybe someone else can see what I saw. If anyone has had similar experiences in the Arizona desert, please let me know. I need to know I'm not crazy, that whatever's out there is real. For now, that canyon holds its secrets, and honestly, I hope they stay there. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've been hesitant to share this for almost 2 years now, but I need to get this off my chest. My friends who were there that weekend still don't like talking about it, and honestly, I get it. Some experiences just stick with you in ways you can't explain to others. It happened during what was supposed to be a week-long getaway in northern Georgia with 5 of my closest friends, Mike, Sarah, Tom, Rachel, and Chris. We'd found this secluded rental property online about 30 minutes outside of Blue Ridge. The photos showed this beautiful 2-story cabin surrounded by dense forest, with a fire pit and a small creek nearby. Perfect spot to disconnect and spend some quality time together, or so we thought. We arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late October. The drive up the gravel road to the property took about 15 minutes from the main road, and I remember thinking how isolated it felt. The rental agent had left the key in a lockbox, so we didn't even see another person during check-in. The cabin itself was nice enough, 3 bedrooms, a decent kitchen, and this massive deck overlooking the woods. We spent that first afternoon unpacking, exploring the property, and setting up for what we thought would be an amazing week. The first strange thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, you expect some silence in the woods, but this was different. No birds, barely any insects, just this heavy stillness that felt wrong somehow. Sarah mentioned it too, but we brushed it off as city folks not being used to the countryside. That first night, we had a great time. We grilled burgers on the deck, had some drinks, played cards, and stayed up late catching up. Everything was normal until about 2 a.m. when I got up to use the bathroom. That's when I first noticed the smell. It's hard to describe, like a mix of wet dog and something rotting, but also musky and wild. I checked the windows, thinking maybe something had died nearby, but they were all closed. I mentioned it to Chris, who was still up watching TV, but he couldn't smell anything. I managed to fall back asleep, but the next morning everyone was talking about the smell. It had apparently gotten stronger during the night, and Tom said it had woken him up around 4 a.m. We spent about an hour checking around the cabin's exterior, looking for dead animals or anything that could explain it, but found nothing. What we did find, though, made my stomach drop. There were these massive footprints in the soft earth near the tree line. I'm not talking about bear tracks. I've seen those before. These were clearly foot-shaped, probably 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were deep, too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Rachel, who's into hiking and wildlife, said she'd never seen anything like them. We took some photos, but they came out weirdly blurry, like the focus wouldn't catch right. The rest of that day was tense. We tried to keep things normal, went for a short hike, staying close to the cabin, played board games, cooked lunch. But there was this underlying anxiety we couldn't shake. The footprints had really rattled us, especially since they formed a clear path around the entire cabin, like something had been circling the property. As the sun started setting, we were all on edge. The smell had never completely gone away, but it was getting stronger again. We decided to stay inside and watch movies, but nobody could really focus. Around 8 p.m., Mike went to grab more snacks from his car and came running back inside, white as a sheet. He said he'd seen something moving between the trees, something massive and upright. We killed all the lights and carefully looked out the windows, and that's when I saw it too. About 50 yards from the cabin, partially hidden by the trees, was this enormous dark figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, and even in the dim light, I could make out broad shoulders and a massive head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, no neck visible. It wasn't moving, just standing there, and somehow that was worse than if it had been charging at us. We watched it for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it moved, not away from us, but towards the cabin. Its gait was smooth but huge, covering ground incredibly quickly. Sarah started crying, and Chris was frantically trying to call 911, but we had no cell service. We'd known that since arriving, but hadn't thought much of it until that moment. The thing stopped about 20 feet from the deck. In the darkness, I couldn't make out facial features, but I could see its outline clearly against the night sky. The smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something primal that made every hair on my body stand up. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. We stayed frozen, lights off, barely breathing, for what must have been another hour. Eventually, it moved back into the tree line, but we could hear it moving around the cabin all night. The footsteps were heavy enough to make the windows rattle slightly. None of us slept. We sat in the living room, backs to each other, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, we threw our stuff in our cars in record time. Nobody wanted to look for more footprints or take pictures. We just wanted out. The drive back was completely silent. What could we even say? We'd all seen it, all heard it, all smelled that horrible smell, but none of us could explain what it was. We made a pact not to talk about it publicly. Who would believe us anyway? But I still think about it almost every day. The property was listed for sale a few months later. I check the listing sometimes, wondering if anyone else has experienced what we did. The weird thing is, looking at photos of the cabin now, the tree line looks different, further back than I remember. It's like the forest itself has changed. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. I've done research on local wildlife, tried to rationalize it as a bear or some other animal, but nothing fits. The size, the way it moved, that smell. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I catch a whiff of that same scent, and my heart starts racing all over again. The 5 of us still get together regularly, but we never talk about that night. We've never gone on another cabin trip either. Some experiences change you in ways you can't really explain to others. I just know that whatever was out there that night wasn't something that was supposed to exist in our world, and I hope I never encounter anything like it again. What happened at our ranch near the Washington-Canada border last fall haunts me to this day. I've always been skeptical of strange stories and wild claims, but after what my family and I experienced, I don't know what to believe anymore. We bought the ranch 3 years ago, my wife Sarah, our 2 kids, Emma, 12, and Jake, 9, and I. It was our dream property, 40 acres with a rustic 3-bedroom house, backing right up against dense forest. The previous owners were an elderly couple who'd lived there for decades without any issues. The property had good fencing for our horses, plenty of room for the kids to play, and our German shepherd, Max, loved having all that space to run around. Everything was perfect until that night in October. The temperature had dropped pretty low, and we'd had our first frost of the season. I remember because I'd spent the afternoon winterizing our equipment and checking the horses' shelter. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary when we went to bed around 10 p.m. It must have been around 2 a.m. when Max's behavior changed. He wasn't barking, which was weird because he usually barks at everything, but he was whining and scratching at our bedroom door. When I let him in, he jumped straight onto our bed, something he's never allowed to do, and started trembling. I figured maybe he'd heard coyotes or something, though his reaction seemed extreme. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but then I realized the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was breathing, deep, heavy breathing, like something massive was right outside our house. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the horse paddock. Sarah woke up and immediately noticed something was wrong. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, getting up to look out the window. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the yard pretty clearly. That's when I noticed the horses were all huddled in the corner of their shelter, which was unusual. They're usually spread out, especially on cold nights. Then we heard the cracking sounds, not small twigs breaking under someone's feet, but the loud, sharp crack of thick branches being snapped like toothpicks. Whatever was moving through the trees at the edge of our property was big, really big. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, something I keep for emergencies, mainly because of the occasional bear. But Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't go out there," she pleaded. I agreed. Whatever was out there, confronting it in the dark seemed like a terrible idea. We spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the sounds. The breathing would come and go, sometimes seeming closer, sometimes further away. Every now and then, we'd hear more branches breaking, and this weird sound that I can only describe as a cross between a grunt and a low moan. When dawn finally came, I went outside to check the property. What I found made my blood run cold. The fence along the forest line, heavy-duty ranch fencing that could hold back a charging bull, was bent and partially torn down. Not broken or cut, but bent, like something had just pushed through it. The metal posts were bent at almost 45-degree angles. But that wasn't the worst part. In the muddy ground near the fence, there were footprints. Not bear prints, not moose prints. I've been around wildlife all my life, and I know what animal tracks look like. These were feet. Huge, human-like feet, easily 16 inches long. They were deep too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I took pictures, but they don't do justice to how unsettling these prints were in person. They followed a path from the forest, through our property, and back into the trees about 100 yards down. Whatever it was, it had walked right past our house during the night. The kids were scared when they woke up, even though they hadn't heard anything during the night. Kids can sense when something's wrong, you know? Max refused to go outside. He'd do his business right by the porch and run back inside. This was a dog who usually loved patrolling the property and chasing squirrels. I spent the morning reinforcing the fence and checking on the horses. They were spooked, but unharmed. I found more broken branches along the tree line, not small ones, but thick branches that would take significant force to break. Some were as thick as my arm, snapped like twigs. Sarah wanted to call the police, but what would we tell them? That something big walked through our property and scared our dog? They'd probably think we were crazy. Instead, I called our nearest neighbor, Jim, who lives about 2 miles down the road. That's when things got even weirder. "Been meaning to call you," Jim said. "Something's been killing our chickens. Not eating them, mind you. Just killing them and leaving them there. Found the coop door ripped right off its hinges last week." That night, we made sure everything was locked up tight. I set up some security lights around the property, the kind with motion sensors. We put the kids to bed in our room, and Max refused to leave our side. The temperature had dropped even lower, and there was this strange stillness in the air. Around midnight, the security lights started triggering, one after another, like something was walking the perimeter of our property. The horses started making distressed sounds from their shelter. Then we heard it again, That deep, heavy breathing, but this time it was closer to the house, much closer. I'll never forget the sound of our front porch steps creaking under heavy weight. Whatever it was right outside our front door. Max was shaking so bad I thought he might have a seizure. The kids were awake now, and Emma was crying silently. Sarah held them both while I stood by the bedroom door with my rifle. Then came the smell, this powerful, musky odor that somehow seeped into the house. It was like wet dog combined with something rotting, but much stronger than anything I'd ever smelled before. Jake started gagging, and I worried he might throw up. The porch light was on, and through the bedroom window I could see a shadow moving. Not just any shadow, something massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing was easily several feet taller than me. It moved in a way that was disturbingly human-like, but not quite right, like its proportions were all wrong. For what felt like hours, it just stood there. Sometimes we'd hear it move around the house, and the security lights would trigger in different areas. At one point, it made this sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and I hope I never hear it again. When morning finally came, we found more footprints, but this time they were everywhere. Around the house, near the kids' swing set, by the horse paddock. Some of the prints were so clear you could see what looked like toe impressions. The front porch had deep scratches in the wood, and there were tufts of dark, coarse hair caught in the fence near the forest. That was 3 months ago. We've had 2 more incidents since then, though not as intense as that night. The last time, about a month ago, whatever it was actually broke one of our security lights. Just reached up and crushed it like it was nothing. The light was mounted 12 feet off the ground. We're selling the ranch. Sarah and I agreed we can't live like this anymore. The kids are terrified. Max is a completely different dog now, and I haven't had a decent night's sleep since it all started. We found a place closer to town, somewhere with neighbors and streetlights. I know how this all sounds. Before it happened to us, I wouldn't have believed it either. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to find some rational explanation. But I know what we experienced. I know what I saw and heard. The strangest part, the realtor who's handling our property sale didn't even seem surprised when we told her why we were selling. Apparently, 3 other properties in the area have gone on the market in the past year for similar reasons. She didn't ask for details, just nodded like she'd heard it all before. Sometimes I think about the elderly couple who sold us the place. I wonder if they had their own stories they never told us. I wonder if that's why they finally decided to leave after all those years. I still have the pictures of the footprints and the damaged fence, and I kept a piece of that dark hair we found. Part of me wants to get it analyzed or something, but another part of me doesn't want to know. Some questions are better left unanswered. All I know is that whatever's in those woods isn't just a bear or a moose or any other animal I'm familiar with. And it's still out there, probably watching other properties, other families. If you're thinking about buying a place up near the Washington-Canada border, particularly around the forests, do yourself a favor. Don't.